Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time, not one adorned with crowns and glory, but one wrapped in shadows, silence, and the scent of forgotten suffering. As the world outside your window begins to quiet down, perhaps the lights dimmed, your body slowly unwinding from the tensions of the day, let your breath deepen. Inhale softly, exhale slower still. Allow yourself to sink into this moment where the present fades and the past begins to unfold like parchment beneath flickering candlelight. Tonight, I invite you not into the courts of kings or the halls of heroes, but through a different kind of threshold, one less spoken of, one far less luminous. You are entering the still, airless room where a feverish body trembles under layers of wool and fear. The wooden door creaks shut. Outside, a world goes on, untouched by the quiet torment behind those stone walls. Inside, a soul drifts, a body decays, and a story, one you've never been told, waits to be heard. This is a tale not of great battles or discoveries, but of the unremarkable, the anonymous, those who, in the long night of the Middle Ages, fell ill, and in falling ill, fell away from everything. Their voices rarely reached the parchment of historians. Their pain left no statues, no songs. But it lingers in shadows, in whispers, in the silent echo of suffering unacknowledged. As you lie there, maybe under warm covers, perhaps with a soft pillow beneath your head, consider for a moment the many others who once lay still in the dark, alone, unwashed, unheld. In the medieval world, to be sick was not merely a physical fate. It was spiritual, social, and existential. A sentence passed without trial. A descent not just into pain, but into silence. Let the room around you fade. Let the distant sounds of your own world grow fainter. The hum of the refrigerator, the far-off barking of a dog, the wind brushing gently against your window, let them all blur into the edges of a new soundscape. The soft crunch of straw under a frail body, the distant toll of a monastery bell marking none but the passage of time, the indistinct prayers of a friar whispered for the dying. Before we begin our story, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always a joy to see our global community gathering for these gentle, historical journeys. And if you find solace, reflection, or calm in these stories, a quiet click on the subscribe button would mean a great deal. It's thoughtful listeners like you who allow these long, winding explorations of the past to continue flowing. Because perhaps, like so many before you, you have found yourself awake deep into the night. Perhaps your thoughts have grown too loud, or your body refuses to rest. Perhaps you carry a weight, emotional, invisible, nameless. If so, know that this space is for you, and that history, in its own quiet way, often has something to offer. Not answers, not fixes, but echoes, reminders that your solitude is shared, that your sorrow is ancient, and that your restless mind walks a path many others have walked before. So rest your eyes, loosen your jaw. Let your breath steady itself like a candle's flame in still air, and allow yourself just for a while to be carried. We're about to descend into an era where illness was not merely an interruption of life, but often its end. A time when to fall sick meant to be forgotten. When healing was not a promise, but a prayer whispered into silence. This is the beginning of our long, slow immersion into the invisible world of medieval illness, a world of cold stone, of damp rooms, of prayers unanswered, and suffering unseen. And as the night stretches on, so too will our story, unfolding gently, with no need to rush. After all, you are here to rest, and I am here to keep watch beside the history few dare to remember. Let us begin. Topical 1. o silêncio do sofrimento invisível. Night thickens like ink spilled across the sky, and within the hush of its folds we begin to drift backward into a time where silence did not mean peace, but abandonment. Into the narrow corridors and thatched roof rooms of a medieval world shaped by prayers, punishments, and fears that could not be named aloud. In that world, sickness was not simply a disruption of the body, it was a fracture of belonging. A quiet excommunication from the ordinary rituals of life. To become ill was not merely to feel pain, it was to be cast out from your neighbors, from your faith, from yourself. Imagine now, if you will, a single room, small, cold. Its walls of wattle and daub hold in the draught, no better than the threadbare cloth stuffed between the wooden slats of the window. In the corner of that room lies a figure on a bed of straw and old linen. Their breath comes slowly, shallowly. Perhaps a low moan escapes from their throat, barely louder than the wind outside. Yet no one answers, because in the Middle Ages, to fall ill was to disappear bit by bit from the fabric of one's own life, from the table where one once shared bread, from the conversations in the marketplace, from the warm press of hands during Mass. The sick were not only feared, they were rendered invisible by layers of belief that equated illness with divine judgment. A cough was not simply a cough, it was a warning sign, a whisper of contagion sent by unseen forces. A fever was not just a bodily response, but a signal of spiritual imbalance, perhaps even demonic interference, and thus the suffering of the sick was witnessed with caution, suspicion, or more often, not at all. What we now consider the most basic act of compassion, sitting beside a sickbed, offering cool water, wiping a brow damp with sweat, was then a risky decision. Not only because of the risk of a contagion, but because kindness could be construed as defiance of the divine punishment that illness was thought to represent. For those who lingered in sickness, especially the poor, there were few paths forward. A nobleman might summon a physician who read the stars and spoke of humors, but for most, there were only prayers whispered anxiously into the night, or worse, silence, deafening, all-encompassing silence. There was a wordless pact in the air. To be ill was to be marked not with sympathy but with distance. Friends turned their gaze elsewhere. Family members moved carefully, speaking little. Priests arrived not to cure but to prepare the soul for what lay beyond, and even they, robed and solemn, often stood at the threshold, rather than entering. This fear, this shrinking away, was not cruelty born of hatred, but of helplessness wrapped in doctrine. Disease was not neutral, it was interpreted as consequence. It carried with it an invisible ledger of sins not yet confessed, of guilt perhaps imagined or inherited. And the sufferer, caught between breath and blame, had little choice but to lie still and fade. The body, left untouched, began to transform. Sores opened, flesh weakened, eyes dulled, hunger disappeared, and through all of it, the world outside continued as if nothing had changed, because to acknowledge the sick too openly was to risk seeing oneself in them. To risk remembering that at any moment it could be your turn to disappear. Some would pray, some would cry out, but most, over time, simply stopped speaking. What was the use? Words echoed back unanswered. Pain, when witnessed, brought only fear. And so they remained quiet. Silent not by choice, but because no one was listening. And yet, within that silence, there was still life, still thought, still the aching memory of warmth, of love, of human closeness. The sick remembered the scent of baking bread, the sound of laughter around a fire, the feeling of fingers intertwined during spring walks through fields. but those memories became as distant as the stars above the monastery's bell tower, bright, unreachable, and fading. You might ask, did no one care? But care is complicated in a world ruled by divine punishment. To care was to question God, and so most chose silence, ritual, and distance. The pain of the sick was soothed only by prayers mumbled behind closed doors, or by the gentle weeping of a child too young to know why they had been told not to touch their mother anymore. When the illness passed quickly, it was called mercy. When it lingered, it was penance. But in either case, the voice of the sufferer was buried under layers of meaning they never asked for. They were not merely ill, they were symbols of warning, of guilt, of the fragile boundary between life and the invisible realm beyond. And what of the spirit, the soul trapped in that trembling body? They felt everything, the slowing of time, the ache in the bones, the hunger not for food, but for a familiar face, a touch, a kind word. The body weakened, but the longing remained sharp. And it was that longing, that unfulfilled human need, that made the silence so devastating. Tonight, as you listen in the quiet of your own space, perhaps wrapped in the warmth of blankets, surrounded by familiar objects, hearing the soft rhythm of your breath, remember that centuries ago, another lay as you do now, though far colder, far lonelier, and with no voice to carry their pain beyond the rough wooden walls of their room. This is the silence we inherit, not just as history, but as echo, a reminder that the world has always struggled to face suffering. That even now, in our age of lights and machines and names for every illness, there are still those who feel invisible. And so we listen, not to fix, not to explain, but simply to hold space for the souls who were left to suffer without witness, for the pain that once filled a room but left no record, for the humanity that endured even as it was forgotten. In this story, we begin not with a name but with a breath, a slow, trembling breath in the dark, the breath of someone left alone. And it is there, in that breath, that our journey into the long night of medieval illness truly begins. The bed, a place we now associate with rest, softness, renewal. But centuries ago, in the quiet corners of medieval homes and sanctuaries, the bed was often something far colder, a final destination, a hushed threshold between life and the unknown. And for many it was not a sanctuary, but a sentence, a narrow, unmoving frame where suffering unfolded slowly, breath by fading breath. Picture a room, bare, with walls of pale, cracked plaster or exposed wood darkened by smoke and time. A low ceiling hangs heavy with the scent of damp straw, old sweat, and soot from a hearth that hasn't been lit in days. In the corner, a bed, or what passes for one. A few layers of flattened hay beneath a thin linen sheet stained with age and use. No pillows, no softness, only the uneven texture of time-worn materials and the steady chill of the floor beneath. On that bed lies a figure. It may be a child, skin too hot for comfort and too pale to be ignored, or an elder, bones sharp beneath loose skin, hands trembling slightly with each shallow breath. Or perhaps a woman in midlife, her body racked by fever, the corners of her mouth dry and cracked. The identity hardly matters. What unites them is stillness and time. For in many parts of the medieval world, once one took to bed in illness, they rarely rose again. There was a practice, a belief passed through whispers and reinforced by fear, that one must remain in bed for the duration of the illness, not to conserve energy, not as medical advice, but because rising was seen as an affront to the divine. To get up too soon, to move about while sick, was believed to be a challenge to God's will. One was meant to surrender, to lie still, to wait. And so they did. The sick lay quietly, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, often with no medicine, no nurse, no comfort. Time did not pass as it does for the healthy. It stretched. A single hour could last the length of a day. The sun's movement across a small window marked their only proof that the world outside continued. In wealthier homes, a servant might occasionally enter, carrying a wooden bowl of broth or a cloth damp with lukewarm water. But for most, especially the poor, care was infrequent and tenderness rarer still. There were no doctors as we understand them, only the occasional village healer or passing monk with a satchel of dried herbs and sacred prayers. The body began to break down in increments, muscles softened, skin bruised under its own weight. And in the stillness, creatures came, vermin that thrived in the straw beneath the bed, insects drawn to heat and sweat and stillness. There are written accounts, whispers in old manuscripts, of men and women whose bodies were found covered in worms while still breathing. Not metaphor, but fact. A reflection of both the conditions and the neglect that allowed suffering to become a kind of rot. Imagine the feeling of being aware of your own decay, the subtle itching that becomes unbearable, the movement beneath the skin, the knowledge that you are still alive, but being consumed. And worse than the pain is the silence that answers every cry, the footsteps that hesitate outside your door but do not enter, the prayers offered from afar instead of the closeness of touch. The body, once a place of movement and expression, becomes inert, and with it the mind drifts into dreams, into memories, into fears that wrap themselves around each breath like smoke. The sufferer begins to wonder, is this the end or merely a test? Have I been forgotten or am I being punished? Outside, life continues. The village well is drawn, the baker's fire is lit, a cart rolls by, the sounds come faintly, muffled by stone and distance. But inside the room, time is still, and the bed becomes an island, cut off from the world by more than just walls, by fear, by belief, by the slow erosion of human connection. It is important to understand this was not cruelty, not in the modern sense. It was a consequence of a worldview in which illness was sacred, dangerous, and above all, contagious not only in flesh, but in soul. The healthy kept their distance not just to preserve their bodies, but their spiritual standing. There are records of households where even a spouse would not touch the other once they had taken to bed. Food was left at the door. Water, when brought, was not handed directly, but placed upon the floor. The fear of transgression was greater than the impulse to comfort, and so in these beds people waited for the fever to break, for the soul to ascend, or for the final breath which might come unnoticed in the early hours of the morning. The body cooled, the eyes stilled, and sometimes no one noticed until the scent gave them away. In such stillness, the line between life and death thinned. And the bed, humble, hard, and lonely, became a place not of healing, but of transition. It cradled not recovery, but resignation. This is the kind of silence the medieval world understood well, a silence that wrapped around the body and muffled the soul, not out of malice, but out of belief, out of fear, out of the long inheritance of centuries that told them to lie in bed with illness was to lie beneath the gaze of heaven itself. And so they waited, without comfort, without certainty, sometimes without hope, and the bed, still and narrow, held them until the waiting was done. In the dim glow of a single candle, the medieval body lay still, fevered, trembling, gasping, and around it, uncertainty hovered like smoke. No stethoscopes, no thermometers, no tests, only eyes, guesses, prayers, and a deep sense that whatever was happening inside the flesh was not entirely of this world. In that time, There were no words for most of what afflicted the human body. There was no tuberculosis, no influenza, no autoimmune disorder. There was only the fever, the shiver, the swelling, the ache, the failing breath. Illness was not classified, but interpreted. It was a sign, a message, a riddle sent by God, or perhaps by the devil, and it was the task of the living to try and read what the body refused to say clearly. The body was not seen as an independent biological machine. It was inseparable from the soul. Every blister, every cough, every change in complexion was viewed not as a symptom, but as a clue to a larger spiritual narrative. And so the sick were examined not with science, but with fear, reverence, judgment. A pale tongue might mean divine punishment. A tight chest could be the weight of unconfessed sin. A bloody stool might signal a disturbance of the humors or a demon gnawing from within. In monasteries and villages alike, the body was a sacred mystery, a vessel. And when it failed, it was believed that the failure had meaning beyond muscle and marrow. Medical knowledge, where it existed, was filtered through ancient texts, often copied and recopied by hand in dusty scriptoriums. The pages spoke of humors, 4 fluids believed to govern the body's health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These humors needed balance. Illness, then, was imbalance. Not something that attacked from outside, but something that rose from within, or was triggered by the stars. Astrology, in fact, played a central role in diagnosis. The position of the planets was consulted before treatments were offered, as it was believed the heavens influenced the tides of blood and spirit. A physician might delay a bleeding procedure if Mars was not in a favorable position, or claim a waxing moon would worsen a fever. The skies were watched as carefully as the patient. And yet, despite these rituals and calculations, most diagnoses remained vague. The words used were broad, imprecise, and heavy with fear. The bad air, the wicked heat, the swelling plague, the internal corruption. These were not explanations, they were placeholders, fragments of understanding wrapped in poetry and dread. This absence of clarity often led to mistakes, some fatal. A seizure might be mistaken for possession, a tumor for a divine curse. A simple infection could be declared a test of spiritual endurance, and so the treatments offered were often not to heal, but to purify, to rebalance the soul through the body, or vice versa. There were those who called themselves doctors, though few had studied anything beyond a few ancient theories and local customs. Some were barbers who had learned to bleed a patient with skill. Others were monks with access to a few medicinal herbs and a deep well of prayers. And others still were little more than charlatans, dressed in robes to inspire confidence, offering talismans and blessings in exchange for coins. For the poor, such options were usually out of reach. They were left to the mercy of family, neighbors, or solitary endurance. And in those homes, small, dark, silent, the illness ran its course as it pleased, while the afflicted body became both a battleground and a mystery, inaccessible to all but God. And so it was that many died, without ever knowing what had taken them. They passed from one world to the next, without a name for their suffering. Their families grieved without understanding. The village whispered about sins or curses, and life moved on. The absence of diagnosis was not just a failure of medicine. It was a deep void where fear and belief grew wild. The sick were not guided, they were judged. And without answers, their pain became a kind of isolation that went beyond physical distance. It became existential, a disconnection not only from others, but from one's own body, from one's own meaning. Imagine lying in that bed, the fever burning, the body unrecognizable in its frailty, and no one, not even yourself, able to say why. No name, no direction, only stares, hushed voices, and perhaps the soft murmur of a priest preparing you for death. Because if the cause is unknowable, then the outcome must be left to fate or to faith, and so the body remained a mystery, holy, haunted, interpreted through scripture and fear, never through certainty, a vessel of signs but not of answers, a site of punishment or testing or divine silence, and that silence, more than anything, echoed loudest through the centuries. In a room heavy with incense and the rustle of cloth, a man kneels beside a wooden basin. The tools are ready, a knife sharp and narrow, a ceramic bowl with a faded rim, and strips of linen once white, now stained by time and countless wounds. The patient lies still, pale against the flickering candlelight, his arm outstretched as though in surrender. What is about to happen is not punishment, it is medicine, or so they believed. To the medieval mind, the body was not only a fragile container of humors and breath, it was a vessel in need of constant correction. Pain was not only tolerated, it was welcomed, because through pain came purification, through suffering came the possibility, however slim, of salvation. Among the many treatments applied to the ill, none was so widespread, so ritualized, or so cruel as the act of bloodletting. The theory was simple. Illness, whatever its form, was caused by an imbalance in the body's fluids. And if the body contained too much of one element, especially blood, it must be released. Not with gentleness. Not with precision, but with force and repetition, until the patient was emptied enough to restore the sacred balance. The veins were opened with a practiced cut, usually in the arm or neck. The blood flowed into bowls, measured not by volume, but by conviction. Some were bled until they fainted, others until they never woke again. Physicians, if they could be called that, spoke in terms of cleansing. They compared the process to pruning a vine or draining a swamp. What they took from the body was not merely fluid, but illness itself, sorrow, corruption. Pain was viewed as transformative, as a necessary violence to ward off greater ruin. And if the patient cried or begged or shook with fear, it was believed to be the sickness leaving the soul. This was not done in moments of dramatic crisis alone. Bloodletting was applied to fevers, coughs, melancholy, even dreams deemed too vivid. A woman overcome with sadness might be bled behind the knees. A man with nightmares might have the veins in his feet opened at dawn. There were charts, bright with stars, and lunar cycles that guided when and where to cut. Some bodies were bled according to astrological alignment, as though the heavens had a voice in the flow of life itself. And all the while, the sick grew weaker. Some could not speak after a session. Others slipped into sleep and never woke. Their blood spilled, not as an offering to health, but to tradition. And no one questioned why their lips turned blue or their hearts faltered. It was simply the will of God or the lateness of the procedure, never the practice itself. Children, too, were not spared. A child who burned with fever was seen as bloated with corrupted fluid, his arms held down by a parent, his cries ignored as the blade touched his skin. For the good of the body, they said, for the cleansing of the soul. In monastic infirmaries where monks practiced both prayer and medicine, the act of bloodletting was wrapped in ritual. Psalms were whispered, crosses drawn in the air, but the blade cut just the same, and the blood ran all the same. At times, patients were bled and then made to fast. No food, no water, only rest and prayer, with their bodies already starved of strength. Death was not uncommon in the days that followed, but when it came, it was rarely attributed to the treatment. It was God's choice. The illness had won. Or perhaps it had been the patient soul that refused to let go of its sins. We often imagine healing as an act of care. But here, care was not gentle, it was not warm, it was structured, harsh, unyielding. The patient was not soothed, he was disciplined. The body was not a garden to be tended, but a battlefield to be conquered. And the physician, or barber, or monk, became not a guardian of health, but a wielder of correction. Some patients refused the blade. Some cried until their voices gave out. But in most cases, they submitted. Because to say no was to reject the wisdom of the elders, the teachings of the church, the rhythms of the stars. And above all, it was to appear faithless. And so they bled, in cottages, in abbeys, in the grand chambers of the nobility, and the humble stalls of the poor. Across Europe, across generations, they bled in fear, in silence, in hope. Not all died, of course, some survived. And in surviving were seen as proof that the practice worked. But their survival was often despite the bleeding, not because of it. Today we look back and wonder how such a thing could be called medicine, how a procedure so invasive, so devoid of mercy, could be so revered. But to judges to forget the desperation, the fear, the utter helplessness of a world without explanation. They cut because they believed, they bled because they hoped, and they suffered because there was no other path, no other guide. And so, in the low light of a medieval chamber, the blade descended again and again, not out of cruelty, but out of the fragile human need to do something, anything, even if it meant draining the life in order to save it. In the quiet morning light of a medieval town, before the bustling of markets or the tolling of church bells, a figure steps out from the shadow of an infirmary, holding in hand a small glass vessel. It glows golden in the rising sun, but the liquid inside is no elixir. It is urine, freshly collected from a trembling patient. And in this liquid, the fate of that person may be written. Such was the belief that dominated medieval diagnostics. In an age where the body was not fully understood but deeply feared and mystified, urine became a sacred text, one to be read with care, reverence, and often dread. The physician, or more often, the astrologer, herbalist, or monk, did not seek the patient's voice. Instead, they sought the language of the body's fluids, and none were so eloquent, so revealing, as urine, clear or cloudy, red-tinged or brown, bitter or sweet on the tongue. Yes, even the taste was part of the ritual. Physicians would swirl it gently in glass, lift it to the light, inhale its scent, and, in some cases, place a drop upon the tongue to decode its message. The logic was simple by the standards of the time. If the body's humors were in balance, the urine would reflect harmony. If something was wrong, spiritually, physically, or emotionally, it would appear in that liquid mirror. These small flasks, known as urinals, became the centerpiece of the healer's table. They were often displayed with care, arranged by color and consistency, like sacred relics of the suffering. And many believed that in those pale golden shades lay the answer to a terrifying question. Will this person live, or will they die? But what did they truly see? Without microscopes or scientific understanding, the interpretations were bound more to symbolism than to biology. A dark hue might indicate anger or too much bile. A pale, almost transparent sample could mean the soul was weakening. A reddish cast might be a sign of divine wrath or of internal bleeding no one could mend. A foul scent might reflect corruption in the bowels or a punishment for some unspoken sin. Each conclusion led to its own treatment. A cloudy sample might be balanced by warm herbs. A sweet-tasting urine, what we now know could signal diabetes, was seen as an excess of pleasure or indulgence, perhaps to be cured by fasting and isolation. A pungent sample might be countered with purging or bloodletting. The treatment rarely helped. But the ritual of reading, of interpreting, gave a shape to the fear. And for the ill, this ritual held weight. They watched closely, eyes darting between the faces of those examining their urine, searching for hope in their silences or despair in their furrowed brows. One drop, one shade too dark, could mean days of additional suffering. It could mean confinement or the soft preparation of death rites. There were entire manuals written to guide these readings. Illustrated texts that displayed the many possible colors and what they were thought to reveal. Red for burning fever, green for pestilence, black for decay of the soul. And while most could not read the Latin these books were written in, the image of the urine wheel became familiar, almost iconic, to healers across Europe. In many homes, the arrival of a urine reader was more anticipated than that of a priest. For some, he brought the only diagnosis they would ever receive. And his words could calm the family or shatter their last thread of hope. This method was not confined to the lowly or the poor. Nobles, queens, even emperors had their urine studied. Entire councils of healers might gather to examine a single flask, and in their careful choreography, the sniffing, the swirling, the silent nods, an entire worldview played out. One in which the body was a sacred puzzle, the illness a riddle, and this golden liquid a glimpse into the divine judgment behind it all. But what did the patients feel? They lay still, often too weak to speak, while others studied their waste, their lives reduced to a sample, a scent, a taste. And still they hoped, because even in such strange practices, there was at least the semblance of attention, of care, of being seen. But as often as not, the verdict brought fear. If the urine was wrong, there would be no celebration, no soft words of comfort. Instead, there might be more cutting, more fasting, or isolation, or whispered preparations for burial. And if the color changed, if the next sample showed deeper corruption, it was taken not as the natural course of disease, but as a sign of spiritual decline. The body, they believed, did not suffer alone. The soul suffered with it, and the urine, like a final letter, revealed the soul state more honestly than the lips ever could. It is hard now, in an age of sterile hospitals and white lab coats, to imagine such a world. A world where glass cups filled with warm liquid could carry so much weight. But for those who lived and died by these readings, it was not absurd. It was ritual. It was belief. And perhaps most painfully, it was their only hope. For in the absence of knowledge, humanity clings to what it can: symbols, patterns, color, and scent. And even a single drop of urine, glistening in the morning light, could mean the difference between being held onto a little longer or being let go. The word hospital today might evoke the image of white corridors, murmuring machines, steady hands administering care beneath fluorescent lights. But to imagine the medieval hospital through that lens is to conjure a mirage. For in that world, centuries ago, the hospital was not a place where lives were saved. It was where they were surrendered. Set behind stone walls, often adjacent to churches or monasteries, these early hospitals were neither sterile nor scientific. They were shadowed spaces where the air was heavy with incense and the odor of rot. The walls echoed not with the brisk instructions of nurses, but with the soft chant of prayers for the dying. Hospitals in the Middle Ages were built not to heal, but to prepare, to receive those near death and accompany them to the edge of it. Inside there were no individual rooms. Privacy was a luxury unknown. Instead, rows of straw mattresses lined the cold stone floor or narrow wooden frames. The sick lay side by side, bodies trembling beneath rough-spun blankets, many already too weak to turn their heads. The straw beneath them, rarely changed, absorbed not only sweat and urine, but blood, pus, the scent of despair. There was little cleaning, less comfort. The beds were places of stillness, where the ill faded quietly into whatever came next. There were no doctors in the modern sense. The care was offered primarily by monks and nuns, souls dedicated more to spiritual than physical healing. They moved slowly through the dormitories, offering prayers, ladles of thin broth, and the sign of the cross. Their faith was deep. Their touch was often gentle, but they were not trained to treat the body. They were there to guide the soul, and the soul was considered the true patient. To many, being admitted to the hospital meant the end was near. It was not a choice one made lightly. The sick resisted it. Families delayed it. Because to walk through that threshold was to be marked, not as one fighting for life, but as one relinquishing it. To enter the hospital was to become one of the dying. There are accounts, sparse whispered, that tell of those who were taken in but who begged to return home. Not out of fear of the illness, but of the stillness, of the beds that bore no names, of the silence broken only by groans and the rustle of monks' robes. The hospital was not only a place of pain, it was a place of abandonment. Outside, the world continued. Children played. Bells rang. But inside, time moved differently, slowly, with weight, with resignation. Hygiene, as we understand it, was absent. The sick often lay in their own filth for days. There were no disinfectants, no gloves, no concept of contagion that could be scientifically managed. And so disease spread, quietly, invisibly from one body to the next. One cough became many. One infected wound became a corridor of infected limbs. Yet despite this, the hospitals were not feared with anger. They were feared with reverence, as places where the spirit encountered its final test. The monks did what they could. They whispered last rites. They offered relics to be kissed. They lit candles at dusk, their flames casting trembling shadows across faces nearing stillness. In some larger cities, the hospitals were attached to orders, charitable, devout, and often overwhelmed. They received the poor, the dying, the deformed, the unwanted, children abandoned by parents too poor to feed them, old women whose joints had stiffened beyond movement, men ravaged by fever or unseen internal wounds. These were not patients in the modern sense. They were the forgotten, the cast aside, the nameless. And in that anonymity, something even more painful emerged: the erosion of identity. There were no charts, no histories, no gentle introductions. You came in sick. You were laid down, and unless someone knew your name and returned to ask for it, you died as one more body among many. Your death would be noted perhaps in a ledger, or not at all. And when death came, it was quiet. There were no machines to alert the staff, no vital signs to monitor, just the sudden stillness of a chest that no longer rose. The monks would come, they would pray, the body would be wrapped and carried away, sometimes to a grave, sometimes to a pit, sometimes simply burned. And the bed would be prepared for the next. The cycle never stopped. And yet, within this grim landscape, moments of tenderness persisted. A nun's whispered hymn beside a child, a monk placing a warm cloth on a fevered brow. Not enough to change the outcome, but enough to remind the dying that they were still human, still seen, still worthy of care, even in the absence of cure. To enter a medieval hospital was to walk the line between this world and the next. It was not a place of return. It was a station on the final journey, a place where hope flickered, but rarely flamed, where prayers were more frequent than medicines, and where the only constant was the solemn, endless procession of lives quietly ending beneath the vaulted ceilings and trembling candlelight. The hospital, then, was not a space of rescue. It was a sanctuary for the forgotten. And for many, it was the last room they ever saw. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds the very end of life. It is not the hush of nightfall or the pause between words. It is the stillness of decision. The moment when someone gripped by illness chooses not to seek help, not to knock at the gates of a hospital or monastery, but to remain at home in a corner of the house on a mat of straw, alone. In the Middle Ages, this choice was neither dramatic nor rare. It was, in many cases, the final gesture of control. The sick, fully aware of what the hospitals were, gateways to death, not life, often refused to be taken. Their reasons were many, but all of them led to one central truth. To go to the hospital was to vanish. To die at home, however humble, was to remain within the walls of memory. Imagine then a one-room house, its walls rough and darkened by soot, its air thick with the scent of cooked grain and wood smoke. In the corner beside the low fire lies someone wrapped in wool and linen. A thin face, sunken eyes, the shallow pull of breath. They have refused to be moved, neighbors have whispered, relatives have pleaded, but the answer remains unchanged. They will stay. To die at home was not only about comfort, it was about dignity. The bed might be harder, the care less frequent, the food scant. But it was theirs, their smells, their sounds, their view of the door where sunlight sometimes spilled in and reminded them of life outside. There was fear, too. Not just of death, which had long since been accepted, but of what awaited at the hospital: abandonment, anonymity, perhaps even indignity. There are accounts, fragments in the margins of medieval chronicles, of people who were taken to hospitals and never spoken of again. Their names were not recorded, their bodies disposed of quietly, no final words with family, no recognition of who they had been. And so, to die at home was to die as oneself, but it was also often to die alone. Families, frightened of contagion, would keep their distance. Friends, unsure of the spiritual meaning of the illness, might stay away. The sick, aware of this fear, sometimes withdrew first, retreating to corners, to barns, to spaces just outside the house, where their presence would not bring discomfort to others. There is something profoundly human in this gesture, the wish not to burden, the silent hope that by isolating oneself, one might protect the people they love. Even in death, the desire to be kind, to vanish gently, without asking too much. But kindness, in these moments, was often indistinguishable from neglect. Days could pass without anyone entering the room. Food might be left by the threshold. Water placed just within reach, but not offered by hand. The ill were treated like vessels of danger. To touch them was to risk impurity. To care too closely was to invite suspicion, or worse, accusation. And so many chose to disappear quietly. There were those who went even further, walking away from their homes entirely into woods, caves, or distant fields, leaving no trace, seeking a place where their death would not disturb anyone. These stories are harder to verify, but they appear in folk songs, in monastic records, in the unearthed bones of forgotten clearings. To understand this fully, one must enter the medieval mindset, where illness was not just physical, but moral, where to be sick was to be seen as touched by punishment. The shame that accompanied disease could be as heavy as the fever itself. Some believed their illness was a sign of sin. Others were told so directly. And so to die away from others was not just an act of privacy, but of penance. And yet, even in their isolation, the dying still longed for voices, for closeness, for the press of a hand. Many whispered prayers aloud, not only for salvation, but for companionship. They spoke to saints, to ancestors. to the wind that slipped in through cracks in the door, anything to feel they were not entirely alone. It is tempting to see this as tragedy, and it is. But it is also testimony to endurance, to the quiet strength of those who chose solitude over spectacle, who held on to the last traces of self even as their bodies failed. These deaths, rarely recorded, rarely mourned in public, leave behind no monuments, but they linger in the architecture of old villages, in the stories passed down by grandmothers, in the quiet reverence with which certain homes were avoided even long after the plague had passed. And in the modern world, their choices echo still, in hospital rooms that some refuse, in the wish to remain at home, surrounded by what is familiar, even if no one remains to bear witness, in the quiet understanding that how we leave matters. To die alone in one's own space may seem unthinkable. But for many in the Middle Ages, it was the final act of resistance, a refusal to let the last breath be taken in a place of cold stone and forgotten names, a final fragile grasp at being remembered as oneself, in silence, in stillness, in home. It begins with a cough or perhaps a fever, or a swelling beneath the arm that grows warm, tender, and then black. At first, it's just one person, a neighbor, a relative, a stranger at the edge of the market. But soon it's a street, a village, a city wrapped in silence, cut through only by bells tolling for the dead. In the 14th century, the arrival of the plague, what we now call the Black Death, did not feel like a disease. It felt like judgment. It spread so fast, so mercilessly, that to the people of the time, there could be only one explanation: divine punishment, an apocalypse by flesh, a sentence passed upon all. It is hard to overstate the fear, not merely fear of dying, but fear of becoming the carrier of death. The one who unknowingly brought doom into a household, the one whose breath, whose touch, whose presence might unravel an entire family. And so the sick were avoided, violently, completely, their homes marked, their bodies abandoned, their names spoken only in whispers. There are stories, many, too many, of people left behind in locked houses, their doors barred from the outside, of children trapped inside with dying parents, of cries that echoed into empty streets, and eventually fell silent. To fall ill during the plague was not only a personal horror, it was a threat to the entire community. It brought shame, suspicion, and in many cases, abandonment. The sense of individual suffering dissolved into a collective panic. No one was safe. And because no one was safe, compassion became a risk too great to take. There were those who tried, priests who continued to minister, nurses who remained at bedsides, but many fled. Records speak of entire villages emptied overnight, the living abandoning the sick and the dead alike. Some people died alone in fields, others collapsed in the streets, untouched even in their final moments. And then there were the burials, if one could call them that. At the height of the plague, there was no time for ritual, no space for reverence. Bodies were piled into carts, wheeled away by masked men whose faces no one saw. The dead were taken to mass graves, pits dug quickly, filled without ceremony. A mother and child, a husband and wife, strangers laid together in one deep, forgotten trench. The living often did not know where their loved ones had been taken. Grief became a quiet, hidden thing. There was no time to mourn, only to survive. Worse still were the stories of those buried too soon, of people still breathing, still aware, cast into the earth with the dead. Whether by accident or by fear, they were given no chance to speak, to plead. The grave swallowed them anyway. This was not only a physical catastrophe, it was a tearing apart of the emotional and spiritual fabric of life. For centuries, death had been accompanied by ritual. A priest, a prayer, a candle, a grave dug with care. The plague stripped all that away. It turned dying into disappearance. Communities fell apart. Bonds of neighborliness, of kinship, of faith, all were tested. Some turned inward. Others turned to violence, searching for someone to blame. Foreigners, heretics, women who lived alone, all became convenient scapegoats for a horror that no one could control. Yet for the sick, in the final hours, the noise of fear faded. What remained was the body, the fever, the swelling, the delirium, and then the silence. Many did not fight. They simply lay back, watched the light shift across the wall, listened to the last distant sounds, and then nothing. Not all perished, of course. Some survived, marked forever by the loss around them. Their villages changed, their families altered beyond recognition. Some returned to find homes empty, streets unfamiliar, churches half deserted. Survivors often bore not only physical scars, but deep psychological ones, a kind of grief too large to name. The plague was not a single event, but a season of death that returned again and again. Each wave brought back the memory, the fear, the silence. And in that silence, what truly died was trust. Trust in one another, in safety, in the future. The sick knew they would not be saved. They knew they might be hidden, or fled from, or taken away in the night. But still, many reached out for a hand, for a prayer, for a moment of human recognition before the final breath. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to speak of numbers, millions dead, cities emptied. But each death was singular. Each one was a body, a life, a story that ended in isolation. The plague was both a collective sentence and a deeply personal one. It did not ask who you were. It did not distinguish rich from poor. It simply came, and in its wake left a world quieter, darker, and unsure of how to begin again. In the world before medicine had names for invisible threats, a single sound could shift the entire atmosphere of a room. The sudden burst of breath, the sharp, uncontrolled expulsion, a sneeze. What today is met with a polite nod or an automatic "bless you" once carried a very different weight, one of suspicion, fear, and in some cases, condemnation. In the medieval imagination, the human body was not a closed system. It was porous. Every sigh, every exhalation, every drop of moisture was believed to carry something unseen, something spiritual, contagious, or cursed. And so when someone sneezed, it was never just a symptom. It was a signal, a warning. In a time when entire villages could be lost to plague or fevers with no known origin, the sneeze was seen as a harbinger, a moment when the veil between health and illness, between purity and danger, was suddenly and involuntarily lifted. A sneeze could mean that death had entered the room, or that sin had found a voice. The earliest associations between sneezing and the soul were not born from cruelty. They were born from fear. Fear of what could not be controlled. Fear of invisible forces. Some believed a sneeze was the soul attempting to escape the body, or that it created a momentary opening through which evil could enter. Others thought it was a sign that the person had been marked, that they carried within them the first stirrings of divine punishment. The result of these beliefs was a society on edge. To sneeze in a public space was to draw eyes immediately, narrowed, cautious, judging. The response was not always vocal, but it was felt. People stepped back. Conversations stopped, faces turned away. Sometimes, worse, followed. There are records, scattered in village ledgers, ecclesiastical documents, and local tales, of individuals being accused of carrying evil or bringing harm simply because of a cough or sneeze heard in a crowded place, a market, a church, a city square. The fear of disease was so deep, so embedded in the rhythms of daily life, that even minor sounds became suspect. A sneeze might result in someone being asked to leave a gathering, to cleanse themselves, to remain at home, or, in the crueler cases, to prove their innocence. But what did innocence mean in a world where illness was interpreted as guilt? Those who sneezed too often might be questioned. Had they angered God? Had they committed a hidden sin? Were they harboring some impurity? Were they possessed? In some regions, families began isolating loved ones after only a few small symptoms, not out of malice, but because of the crushing pressure of community suspicion. A single sneeze could unravel a household's place in the village. People avoided homes where someone had been heard coughing. They crossed the street to bypass those who had recently fallen ill. The isolation was not only physical, it was social, emotional, and deeply spiritual. Imagine now a woman in her middle years walking through a crowded corridor in a monastery town. She feels the familiar tickle in her nose. Her breath catches. Her hands freeze, but it is too late. The sneeze escapes, echoing sharply against the stone. She looks around. Faces stiffen. No one says a word, but she knows. That evening, her neighbor avoids her. The baker speaks more curtly. Her child is not invited to play. No one explains. No one needs to. The meaning is already there, in the silence. There were times when this fear took on legal consequences. In outbreaks of pestilence, local authorities would sometimes issue decrees limiting contact with anyone showing symptoms. Not scientific symptoms as we know them, but visible, audible signs, sweating, coughing, sneezing. Those marked were told to remain home, to hang a cloth at the door, to submit to the rituals of cleansing, prayer, or seclusion, and once marked, it was hard to be unmarked, because what lingered longer than illness was memory, the memory of sound, the sound of someone sneezing during Mass, the way others turned to look. And how, days later, the whispering began. This fear was not entirely irrational, of course. In the absence of understanding, people reached for patterns, and when illness swept through communities like fire, every spark was feared. A sneeze, though common, was not dismissed. It was watched, interpreted, and in many cases, judged. Some tried to mask it, to cough into sleeves, to pretend nothing had happened. But in tight spaces and close quarters, nothing went unnoticed. And for those already marginalized, women without husbands, the elderly, travelers with unfamiliar accents, a sneeze could become the final reason to be cast out. The sound of a sneeze is brief, a second, no more. But in the medieval world, its echo could last far longer. It could cling to a name, to a home, to a life already made fragile by circumstances beyond control. And so, people learned silence. They learned to hold back breath, to bite the inside of the cheek, to walk away before the body betrayed them, all in the hope of preserving not just their health, but their place in the world. For in that time, a single sound could open the door to isolation, suspicion, and a loneliness deeper than illness itself. He approaches through the mist of early morning, the sound of his boots muffled by the damp earth. In one hand, he carries a staff used not for walking, but for distance. In the other, a leather satchel filled with herbs, wax cloths, and sometimes written prayers. His body is shrouded in a long, dark robe, tightly fastened at the wrists and ankles, but it is the mask that holds your gaze, long, curved, bird-like, grotesque. The eyes are darkened circles, hollow. The beak extends unnaturally from the face, stuffed with pungent herbs and strong-smelling oils. This is the doctor of the plague, not a healer in the modern sense, but an icon of dread, a walking omen, more spectral than savior. In the midst of the Black Death and its aftermath, these masked figures became a familiar presence in the towns and cities where death ruled. They were sent for not in hope, but in protocol, to mark the dying, to make records of the dead, to sometimes perform bloodletting or administer perfumed poultices, but more often to serve as a physical symbol that something terrible had arrived. The outfit was not ornamental, it was born of belief and desperation. At the time, the miasma theory prevailed, the idea that disease spread through bad air, heavy with moral and physical corruption. The beaked mask was designed as a barrier, filled with ingredients thought to filter and purify the poisonous atmosphere: lavender, mint, camphor, myrrh, vinegar-soaked sponges. Each doctor chose their own blend. The thick robe, often made of waxed fabric or treated leather, was meant to prevent infection from clinging to the skin. Gloves and boots sealed the limbs. The staff allowed the physician to examine patients or lift sheets without touching them directly. But behind all this protection, behind the rigid posture and the blank, unreadable mask, there was often little knowledge, only ritual. The presence of a plague doctor did not mean healing had arrived. It meant death was near. To see one at your door was not a relief. It was a summons. Children hid behind curtains. Women wept at the sound of the staff tapping on the street. Families, upon seeing the black silhouette move through the alleys, might close their shutters, cross themselves, or begin preparing for burial before a single word was spoken. And still the doctors came. Most were not trained in anatomy or medicine as we understand it. Many were appointed by towns out of obligation, their role closer to that of an administrator than a caregiver. They recorded deaths, estimated causes, sometimes offered instructions for the disposal of the dead. Few truly believed they could stop the plague, but they were expected to try. Some were brave, others opportunistic. Some demanded high pay for their risks. Others did their work in anonymity, never removing their masks in public. There were those who died quickly, overwhelmed by the very disease they sought to understand. And those who survived, marked by the horror they had witnessed, never returned to such work again. The image of the plague doctor became etched into the collective psyche, not as a symbol of safety, but as a figure from a nightmare. Something between man and monster, a creature of leather and silence, faceless and emotionless, stepping through the ashes of a world unraveling. And yet, the people clung to them, because they were perhaps the last human contact one would have. They might speak softly, offer last rites, carry messages to loved ones, or simply watch, unmoving, as the breath faded from a fevered chest. Their presence reminded the dying that someone had come, that the end was not entirely without witness. But the mask, over time, lost its function. The herbs rotted, the robe grew stiff with use, and the fear it evoked became greater than the protection it provided. The very sight of it came to mean despair. The sound of the staff meant that the sickness had arrived, that the house was now part of the tally. To this day, the mask endures in popular memory, not as a tool of medicine, but as a relic of terror, a costume worn by those who walked among the dying with no cure to offer, only the rituals of a society grasping in the dark. It is easy to look back and call it absurd. But to those who lived then, surrounded by bodies, overwhelmed by the stench of death and the collapse of order, the mask was not absurd. It was armor, a prayer stitched into fabric. A desperate attempt to survive when nothing else remained. And behind every mask was a human being, breathing shallowly, hoping the herbs would hold, that the robe would be enough, that this day would not be their last. In a time when science was only a distant dream, this was what medicine looked like: a shadow at the door, a beak, a silence, and then the closing of the shutters. The candle flickers, casting long shadows over a table not of polished oak, but of rough-hewn planks darkened by age and the weight of suffering. On this table lie small pots, clay bowls, bundles of herbs tied with twine, and in their midst, stranger things. Materials not of comfort or cure, but of revulsion. A smear of blood on cloth, a spoon caked with dried excrement, a powder gray as bone, ground from ashes. In the medieval world, healing did not often mean cleanliness. It meant ritual, submission, and the use of what was believed to hold power, whether sacred, bodily, or symbolic. And so the ingredients of many so-called remedies came not from gardens alone, but from the very bodies they sought to heal, or from the traces left by pain and death. Excrement was not merely waste. It was a substance believed, in some contexts, to carry within it the heat of the body, the remnants of bile, or the residue of divine correction. It was applied to wounds, often mixed with vinegar or herbs thought to draw out poison or restore balance. In certain cases, feces were ingested, tiny amounts wrapped in bread or diluted in wine, offered to those whose suffering was believed to stem from internal corruption, a bitter medicine swallowed in desperation beneath eyes that looked not with disgust but with hope. Blood was another favored element. Human blood, animal blood, sometimes menstrual blood, was considered potent. When ingested or applied, it was thought to pass on strength, vitality, or even holiness. Some believed the blood of the young could invigorate the old. In more extreme cases, fragments of executed criminals, hair, nails, dried blood, were ground into mixtures for those seeking protection from unseen forces. The belief was not in science, but in transfer, that strength or punishment or spirit could move from one vessel to another. And then there were the ashes from burned herbs, from bone, from pieces of clothing worn by the sick, sometimes even from the bodies of the dead, carefully collected, stored in pouches, and added to infusions meant to purge illness from the soul. To modern eyes, these practices seem horrifying, but in their time, they were not perversions. They were hope, made tangible, made drinkable, made spreadable over wounds that refused to close. The boundary between what was sacred and what was profane blurred easily. A relic of a saint might sit beside a bowl of sheep dung. A priest's blessing might follow the smearing of pig's fat onto a tumor. There was no hygiene, there was only belief. And the belief was that suffering could be drawn out by that which repelled the senses. That healing required not comfort, but confrontation with the body's filth, with the mystery of pain, with death itself. Mothers rubbed their infants with the saliva of dying relatives. Lovers exchanged blood in the hope of curing ailments. Fragments of skulls were boiled into broth. Salves were made from the livers of animals mixed with ashes from the hearth. The recipes varied, but the essence remained. To heal the body, one had to pass through the realm of decay. These treatments were not limited to the poor or the desperate. Even noble families turned to them when physicians failed. Behind closed curtains in castle chambers, servants stirred foul-smelling potions while aristocrats writhed in pain. Gold could buy more elaborate ingredients, but not certainty. To be sick was to be vulnerable not only to disease, but to the rituals that surrounded it. A patient might be fed ashes believing it to be sacred powder, might be bled and then made to drink broth laced with waste, might have their wounds packed with rotting leaves and goat dung, believing that the earth would reclaim the illness it had once birthed. There was desperation in every gesture, a willingness to endure anything, consume anything, if only it might bring relief, if only the fever might break, if only the breath might steady again. And though these methods rarely cured, the rituals themselves brought a kind of order. They gave the illusion of action, the comfort of doing something. In a world where illness came without warning, without pattern, and often without mercy, these foul-smelling brews and pastes were not merely treatments. They were anchors. They tethered the sufferer to a process, to hands that tried, to eyes that watched, to the small, trembling hope that this foulness might save them. We remember them now as curiosities, as horrors of the past. But for those who lay still under coarse blankets, for those whose bodies had begun to rot from within, they were one last line drawn against the dark. A line made not of reason, but of faith, and of everything the body could offer, even in its decay. In a cradle made of rough wood, lined with linen already yellowed by time and use, a small figure stirs weakly. The sound is barely a breath, a whimper perhaps. A tiny body, warm with fever, curled in sleep that is not rest, but exhaustion. Around the cradle, silence, not the hushed reverence of care, but the stillness of resignation. In the Middle Ages, childhood was fragile, not only physically, but existentially. To be born was not a promise of life, but the beginning of a test that many would not survive. Illness in children was as common as the seasons and nearly as inevitable. Fevers, infections, malnutrition, injuries left untreated, any of these could take a life within days, sometimes hours. But the response often was not panic. It was acceptance, not out of indifference, but out of deep, practiced grief. Because death among children was so frequent, it was woven into the fabric of daily life. In some villages, it was unusual for a family to have more than one or two children survive to adulthood. Infants died in the night. Toddlers coughed themselves into silence. And so a quiet culture of emotional caution took root. Parents, especially mothers, loved their children, but with restraint. The fear of loss hung over every cradle. To attach too deeply, too quickly, was to risk a kind of heartbreak that could not be spoken, and so affection was sometimes measured not out of coldness, but as a shield. When a child fell ill, few options existed. The poor could not afford the traveling healer or the prayers of a private priest. They turned instead to amulets, whispered chants and poultices made of herbs gathered from nearby fields. Mothers pressed cool cloths to hot foreheads. Fathers stood at the door, helpless. Older siblings watched in silence, already familiar with what was coming. If the illness deepened, the child might be laid apart from the others. Not isolated in cruelty, but in sorrowful preparation. The fire dimmed, the room quieted. A candle burned low. Sometimes the family simply waited. And when death came, it came without drama. The child's body, still small and light, was wrapped quickly in linen or coarse cloth. If there was time, a few prayers were spoken. If not, the burial followed quietly. Some families buried their young in the corner of the village graveyard, others in the fields behind the house. Names were not always carved, songs were not always sung. The death of a child, though devastating, was often recorded with few words. In the ledgers of parishes, one might find a brief note, infans mortuus, child deceased, without further detail. No cause, no age, no mention of the mother's tears or the father's silence. And yet, grief did exist. It lived beneath the surface in the quiet rituals that followed. In the way a mother might leave the cradle untouched for weeks. In the way a father might pause just briefly when passing the place where the child once played. There are remnants of lullabies from this time that carry strange tones, half comfort, half farewell, songs that soothed while acknowledging the closeness of loss. In these verses, one can feel the weight of love carried not with joy, but with fear. The Church taught that unbaptized infants could not enter heaven, but remained in limbo, a place without suffering, but also without the presence of God. This belief shaped how families mourned. A child lost before baptism was not merely dead. They were unreachable, a soul forever adrift. And so parents rushed to baptize newborns even moments after birth. A priest might be summoned in the night. In some cases, midwives performed the rite themselves, pouring water over the newborn with trembling hands. Despite these efforts, not every child could be saved, and those who died often left behind not legacy, but silence. No paintings, no portraits, no letters or stories. Only memories carried quietly by those who had dared to love them. In the homes of the wealthy, grief wore different clothes. Nannies and tutors might recall a child's laughter, and poets might write short laments. But even here, survival was uncertain. The diseases did not respect rank. They claimed princes and peasants alike. One of the most painful truths of medieval life was that to be a child was to be always on the edge of vanishing. And to lose a child was to endure that vanishing without comfort, without recognition, often without words. It is easy to imagine the Middle Ages as a world of constant hardship, but within that hardship was immense tenderness hidden, perhaps, behind walls of silence. Parents who carried tokens of their lost children in their clothing. Midwives who whispered the names of the dead long after others had forgotten them. Priests who prayed over tiny graves in the early hours of the morning, long after the family had gone home. These were not people who did not feel. They were people who could not afford to show it too often or too openly. And so, children passed into the earth quickly, quietly, and those who remembered them did so in the softest tones, behind closed doors, in moments when no one else was looking, condemned to the margins of memory, and yet, in some hearts, never truly forgotten. In the flickering half-light of a village evening, where shadows stretch long across dirt paths and doorways are shut, more out of fear than nightfall, a woman coughs. It is not a violent cough, but persistent, dry, hollow. Her neighbors hear it through the walls. They exchange glances, lower their voices. One crosses herself, another tightens the scarf around her neck, and quickly turns away. For many women in the Middle Ages, illness was not simply a battle of the body. It was an accusation waiting to unfold. To be a woman and to be unwell was, all too often, to stand at the edge of suspicion, because when women showed symptoms that were misunderstood, tremors, bleeding, hallucinations, or even something as ordinary as menstrual irregularities, they were frequently seen not through the lens of care, but through the fog of fear. The medieval world struggled to explain illness. Without science, explanations turned toward religion and superstition. And when those failed, toward scapegoating. And women, particularly those who lived alone, who knew herbs, who had knowledge that was not sanctioned, became easy targets. A woman who had frequent seizures might be labeled possessed. One who bled too long or not at all might be accused of unnatural power. A midwife whose patients died in childbirth might find herself whispered about. A widow whose neighbors fell ill could be branded a cause. And the line between sickness and sorcery was perilously thin. In a culture that valued female silence, obedience, and passivity, any deviation could be threatening. A woman who cried out too loudly from pain, who wailed during fevered nights, who wandered while delirious. These were not seen as signs of suffering. They were signs of instability, of uncleanliness, or worse, of contact with the demonic. Gynecological disorders, poorly understood and surrounded by taboos, were especially dangerous. A woman experiencing convulsions or emotional disturbances during menstruation or childbirth could be suspected of harboring evil within. Her body was no longer just a vessel, it was a battleground, and many believed it could host forces not of this world. Worse still were women who practiced healing. Some were midwives, others herbalists. Some had learned from mothers and grandmothers. They brewed teas, applied poultices, whispered prayers passed down through generations. For their communities, they were often the only source of relief. But when treatments failed, or when they succeeded too well, they could be accused of meddling with powers that were not theirs to wield. A woman might cure one fever and be praised, cure another and be envied, cure a third and be feared. Accusations could begin with a glance, a word, a moment of bad fortune, a healthy cow that sickened, a child who failed to thrive, a neighbor who died too quickly. In times of collective suffering, especially during plagues or poor harvests, the need for someone to blame intensified, and the sick woman, especially if she was different, older, single, outspoken, became a vessel for that blame. Interrogations were crude, confessions often coerced. Some women, feverish and delirious, confessed to acts they had never committed, flying, summoning spirits, causing miscarriages. Not because they believed these things, but because their minds were broken by illness, by fear, or by the long, painful days of isolation and accusation. In many cases, the process ended in silence. A woman disappeared, her home left abandoned, a name no longer spoken aloud. In others, it ended more violently, with public trials, with flames, with the slow erasure of not only her life, but her story. What makes this chapter of history so heavy is not only the suffering, but the confusion at its core. Women turned to for care were condemned. Those whose bodies betrayed them were punished for it. Pain, already deep and disorienting, was made heavier by the weight of judgment. And yet many continued to heal, to help, to endure. They brewed in secret, spoke quietly, tended to the dying when no one else would, risked their own safety to offer comfort in a world that offered them little in return. Some left behind traces, scraps of writing, fragments of recipes, whispered names in village memory, but most faded, taken by the twin shadows of sickness and suspicion. To be a woman and to be ill in the medieval world was to risk not only death, but accusation, not only suffering, but stigma. And behind every such story is the echo of a voice, a body, a presence that tried, despite it all, to survive. And sometimes, simply by surviving, she became feared. The skin burns, the breath comes in short, uneven pulls. The room, already dim and airless, seems to spin. A damp cloth rests on the forehead but offers little relief. Outside, life continues. Chickens cluck in a courtyard, a church bell tolls. The heat rises not from the sun, but from within. A fire with no flame, no light, only the silent consuming of flesh and thought. In the Middle Ages, fever was not merely a symptom, it was a message. Where today we see an immune response, a sign of infection, a biological process, those who lived centuries ago saw judgment. Fever was the manifestation of divine will, a test, a punishment, or a trial of the soul. It was the body's visible cry for forgiveness, or its slow disintegration under the weight of unspoken guilt. To run a high fever was not simply to be sick. It was to be unclean, touched by something higher or lower than human. Some believed it was the heat of purgatory rising prematurely. Others saw it as the fire of the Holy Spirit attempting to purge sin from the blood. And so, care was often withheld. To cool the body was to interrupt God's will. Water was rarely used, not even to wash. Cold compresses were considered dangerous. Ventilation, too, was feared, as drafts were believed to invite spirits or worsen imbalance. Windows remained shuttered. Blankets were piled high. The sick were left to sweat through their judgment, their bodies trembling beneath layers of wool and linen, their breath thick in the still air. This practice, meant to respect divine intention, often hastened death. The fevered became delirious. They mumbled prayers or nonsense. They saw visions, spoke to the dead, cried out to saints. And these utterances were not dismissed as the mind's unraveling. They were noted, interpreted. A fever dream could be taken as prophecy or as confession. In some monastic communities, the feverish were regarded with a strange kind of reverence. Their suffering was thought to bring them closer to God. A monk burning with fever might be kept in isolation, not out of concern for contagion, but to allow the divine fire to complete its work. He was not healed, he was sanctified by suffering. But outside the cloisters, in peasant homes and urban hovels, fever was rarely so poetic. It was terror, the head swelled, the tongue swelled. The skin turned red, then ashen. Bodies shook with chills, then sweated through thin sheets. The sick called out, not for salvation, but for relief. And more often than not, none came. Mothers watched their children burn with it, their small bodies rigid with heat, their eyes rolling back into silence. Husbands stood over wives who no longer knew their names. Elders, long stoic, cried like children, and through it all, the belief lingered. This was not merely illness, this was consequence. What made fever so cruel was its ambiguity. It could pass in a day or last for weeks. It could end in healing or in silence. And because it came on suddenly, without visible wound or mark, it felt otherworldly, as if the soul had been summoned to answer for something it could no longer remember. The treatments varied. Bloodletting, of course. Herbal brews, often warm and bitter. Prayers whispered over steaming cups. Charms tied around the wrist or ankle. In some places, the ashes of saints' bones were mixed into drinks. In others, hair was cut and burned, the smoke allowed to drift over the fevered body as a plea to the heavens. Yet for all the rituals, most knew the truth. There was little to be done. The fever chose. It passed or it did not. It spared or it did not. And when it did not, death came slowly, breath by breath, word by word, until the room grew still and the air no longer shimmered with heat. In the aftermath, families looked not only for causes, but for meaning. Why this person? Why now? What had been left unconfessed? What sin had gone unnoticed? And sometimes these questions were turned outward. Accusations flew. Someone must have cursed the house. Someone must have drawn evil into the village. The fever was rarely allowed to be random, but sometimes in the quietest homes, it was accepted. Not with peace, but with resignation. A father would light a candle. A mother would sit beside the bed, whispering lullabies not to soothe, but to say goodbye. A child would hold the hand of a sibling already far away in the eyes, and in those final moments, no one asked for explanations, only that the suffering end. To us, fever is a warning sign, serious but treatable. But in the Middle Ages, it was a fire in the blood, a divine riddle, a reckoning. It left behind not only the sickbed, but a shadow on the soul of those who witnessed it. And in that heat, in that trembling, many felt not just illness, but judgment passed without words. A winding road disappears into the horizon. Dust clings to bare feet, and each step is a quiet agony. The sun presses down without mercy, and the only sound is the steady shuffle of bodies, leaning into pain. Among them walks the sick, not in carriages or litters, but on foot, often wounded, fevered, bleeding. Not toward a hospital, not toward shelter, but toward hope wrapped in stone and silence. In the Middle Ages, when earthly cures failed, many turned to the heavens, and thus began the long, slow journeys of the sick, pilgrimages, not for recovery in the physical sense, but for redemption, intercession, and sometimes release. These were not leisurely walks. They were acts of devotion, carved into the body with every mile. The pilgrim often walked barefoot, some crawled, others dragged themselves forward with sticks or makeshift crutches. The ill, the maimed, the blind, the possessed, all moved towards sacred sites with the belief that proximity to the holy might cleanse what medicine could not. The destinations varied. The shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, the relics of St. James in Compostela, the holy waters of Lourdes, or lesser-known village chapels where a single miracle had once occurred. Each site offered no guarantees but carried the weight of possibility. And for the sick, even the slimmest thread of possibility was enough. Families sometimes sent their ailing members alone. Others walked together singing hymns, carrying icons. Some carried the ill on their backs. Others left them at the gate of the shrine, unable to go further. The pilgrimage was both journey and surrender, an act of desperation wrapped in ritual. What awaited them was often not relief, but death. Shrines overflowed with the bodies of the dying. Monks and priests offered blessings, pressed relics to burning foreheads, whispered psalms into ears already drifting toward silence. Candles flickered around beds of straw. The air reeked of incense and decay. And yet the hope remained. Some were cured, or believed themselves to be. These stories spread quickly. A blind man who saw the altar, a girl who rose after a single touch, a wound that sealed overnight. Such tales gave meaning to the suffering of thousands who would never return. The journey itself was a form of penance. The body was broken not only by illness, but by intention. Blisters, hunger, exposure to the elements, these were embraced as offerings. Each hardship was seen as a prayer in motion, a way to prove worthiness, to erase sin, to show the heavens that one's pain was not only passive, but willingly borne. Among the sick were those who had committed no crime, but felt they had. Guilt for surviving a plague that took others. Shame for thoughts, dreams, or desires considered impure. The pilgrimage became confession through distance, an apology carved into the land with each footstep, and sometimes they died before they arrived. Along the roads to these sacred places lie unmarked graves, bones buried quickly beside hedges, beneath trees, under stones. The path itself became their final resting place. No relic touched their skin, no holy water passed their lips. But still they had walked, still they had tried. Even those who reached their destination did not always receive comfort. The shrines were crowded, unsanitary, overwhelmed. Some were turned away. Others lay in the corners of chapels, unnoticed as life slowly left them. And yet, to die there, in the shadow of saints, was believed to hold meaning. The relics themselves, bones, garments, drops of blood preserved in crystal, were believed to channel divine power. Touching them could ignite healing. Being near them, even at the end, could offer salvation, and for those who had no other path, this was enough. Pilgrimage was not only the journey of the healthy seeking blessing, it was the march of the broken toward something larger than themselves. It was a way to place one's suffering within a story of redemption, of forgiveness, of divine attention. Even today, faint traces of those journeys remain. Worn paths across fields, chapels at crossroads, stones smoothed by countless kneeling hands, and in these places the memory of those who once walked not for health, but for peace. The medieval sick did not always hope for healing, but they hoped to be seen, to be known, to be acknowledged in their pain. And so they walked, one foot in agony, one foot in faith, toward the silence that might finally answer. The room is small, dim, and thick with the scent of earth, smoke, and sweat. Outside, cold wind rattles loose shutters, but inside, the air is stifling. In the center of the space stands a furnace, its bricks glowing faintly from within. Near it, a body is stripped of all but a thin cloth, trembling with both fever and the knowledge of what is to come. There is no doctor, only a figure with calloused hands and a firm grip preparing to open the furnace door. In many corners of the medieval world, illness was not merely seen as imbalance or infection. It was a presence. Something to be forced out. A visitor that needed to be expelled from the body by any means necessary. And among the stranger, more painful attempts to do so was a method both crude and cruel, the attempt to sweat out the sickness by artificial heat, or the application of hot substances. The logic followed a belief as old as suffering itself. That heat cleansed, that warmth could push disease outward. That fire, not just spiritual but physical, could chase away what prayers and potions could not. Sometimes the patient was placed in a room with a roaring fire, wrapped in woolen blankets from head to toe. No ventilation, no air, just the slow, creeping sensation of suffocation. The goal was not comfort, it was perspiration. Dripping, convulsive, uncontrolled sweating meant the illness was breaking loose. But in more desperate or rural cases, the process took darker turns. In some places, the sick were led to the edges of ovens, still warm from baking, and made to stand or sit beside the heat. Others were placed on boards inside low clay structures, with the fire doused but the stones still hot. The flesh burned slowly, skin reddened, then blistered. The illness, it was said, would be drawn to the surface, where it could be released. And in the most extreme forms, dung was used. Hot animal dung, sometimes fresh, sometimes fermented, was packed around the patient's limbs, back, or chest. The belief was that its natural heat, along with its strong smell and connection to the animal world, could draw out the malevolent forces believed to cause disease. The sick lay still, coated in waste, eyes closed against the sting, breathing through cloth to avoid choking on the fumes. The body reacted as one might expect: burns, infections, scarring. Some endured hours of this treatment, too weak to protest. Others cried out in pain, only to be told the screams were signs the method was working. There are reports, rare, and mostly buried in private letters or accounts passed between healers, of patients dying during such rituals, overheated, asphyxiated, their final hours not of calm, but of agony. And yet, the practice continued, because when hope fades, tradition fills the void. The ritual was sometimes accompanied by chants, prayers, or even rhythmic tapping on the floor. Some believed the body needed rhythm to guide the illness out. Others believed that smoke, if inhaled in large quantities, would drive the disease to the skin. Still others thought illness fled from foul smells, and so would burn feathers, hair, or dried excrement in the room. To modern eyes, these acts seem grotesque, inhumane. But to those who lived through the long nights of plague and unexplained fever, they were rituals of desperation. They were not done out of malice. They were done because no one knew what else to do. The healers believed, the families hoped, the sick endured. For some, these treatments seemed to bring relief, temporary, perhaps psychosomatic or coincidental. A fever that broke after such a trial was hailed as proof. A single recovery validated 100 failures, and so the methods endured. Passed from parent to child, from elder to apprentice, from fear to fear. And for those who suffered, there was little choice. To refuse was to risk being seen as faithless, ungrateful, or even marked by something darker. To resist was to risk isolation. And so they complied. Lay still, closed their eyes, waited for the fire to end them or save them. What remained after were bodies marked by more than illness, scars, blisters, the scent of smoke lingering in their hair for days, and the memory of pain so raw, so close to death, that recovery itself became a kind of haunting. There is something deeply human in these rituals, in the urge to act when helpless, to sweat, to purge, to force meaning onto suffering through ritual and sensation, even when that meaning is pain. And so the rooms grew warm, the cloths soaked through, the screams muffled, and somewhere beneath the layers of heat, a life tried to endure or escape. The hand hovers in midair, uncertain. It trembles just slightly, caught between instinct and fear. Before it, a face, sickly, pale, eyes searching. A child reaches for their mother. A friend leans toward a brother. A wife kneels beside her husband. And yet, the hand does not fall. It stays aloft, frozen, as if by lowering it, one might bring ruin not only upon oneself, but upon everyone else as well. In the Middle Ages, to touch was not simply to comfort, it was to risk, and in many cases, to be condemned. The human hand, source of healing, of labor, of prayer, became, in the time of disease, a vessel of danger. It could transmit what was feared. It could absorb what was cursed. And so people learned to pull away, even from those they loved most. This fear was not baseless in experience. Illnesses like the plague spread rapidly and often inexplicably. One day a neighbor would cough. 2 days later, an entire family would be gone. With no knowledge of germs or invisible pathogens, people relied on observation and superstition. The conclusion came swiftly: touch could destroy. And so walls were raised, not of stone, but of distance. A mother might leave food outside the door of a fevered child, but not dare to cross the threshold. A husband might sleep in a barn while his wife lay sick inside, not from cruelty, but from dread. Friends stopped embracing. Neighbors avoided handshakes. And the sick, once held, kissed, cradled, were left to lie still, untouched, as if even affection itself had turned to ash. This physical withdrawal had a weight far greater than pain. It was the slow loss of humanity, the sense that one's very body had become offensive, that what once comforted now repelled. For children, this was especially brutal. The absence of touch is a kind of silence, and for the young it can feel like abandonment. A child who coughed too much might find arms no longer opening, who cried in the night might cry alone. Even their playmates would be forbidden to sit nearby. They were not only ill, they were avoided, as if by turning from them, others might turn away their fate. And for women, especially mothers, this absence cut deepest. The maternal instinct to soothe, to embrace, to shield, fought bitterly with the learned fear of contamination. Some disobeyed, pressed their lips to hot foreheads, held small hands until they went cold, but others, hearts breaking, stayed back. Not from lack of love, but because they were told that love, expressed through touch, could become deadly. There were those who believed that illness itself carried a spiritual weight, that to touch a sick person was to invite their suffering into your own body, your own soul. That sickness could leap from flesh to flesh through the skin, not only as infection, but as judgment. Holy men advised restraint. Some encouraged the sick to isolate completely, not only for practical reasons, but as spiritual trial. To be untouched was to be purified. To endure abandonment was to prepare for the soul's reckoning. And so the touchless body became not only a victim, but a symbol of sin, of testing, of divine will. This thinking shaped the way communities responded to outbreaks. The sick were kept behind closed doors. Those who ventured near wore amulets, carried candles, recited psalms beneath their breath. And most of all, they did not touch. Even after death, the fear lingered. Corpses were handled with sticks, wrapped in cloth by gloved hands, buried quickly without ritual contact. The sick, in their final hours, often reached for hands that did not come. They died without an embrace, without a final brush of fingers across the cheek. And yet, in the shadows of this fear, love persisted. There are stories, quiet, rare, of those who defied the rules. A daughter who climbed through a window to hold her mother's hand, a priest who ignored his own safety to anoint the dying, a child who curled beside a fevered sibling, needing closeness more than protection. These moments were not praised. Often they were hidden, but they remained. Acts of defiance against the rule of fear. Acts of humanity that refused to let the body become a prison. Touch, denied, becomes mythic. It lingers longer in memory than pain. And for many in the Middle Ages, it was the absence of touch, not the illness itself, that left the deepest scars. To be avoided, to be stared at but never reached for, to be loved but not held. These are wounds that do not heal in the flesh, but in the soul. And so the hands stayed still, hovering, hesitant. And the sick learned to say goodbye not with a kiss or a caress, but with a glance, a whisper, or the quiet hope that one day they would be remembered, not as a danger, but as someone once worthy of being held. The body convulses, eyes roll back, a guttural sound escapes the lips, half breath, half cry. Limbs flail, as if against invisible chains, and then stillness, silence. The chest rises and falls unevenly. A child whimpers nearby. An elder crosses themselves in haste. A priest is summoned, not a physician, a priest. In the Middle Ages, illness did not live in the blood or the brain alone. It lived in symbols, in interpretations, in the realm of unseen spirits. And epilepsy, sudden, violent, frightening, was not understood as a neurological disorder. It was believed to be possession. To witness a seizure in a small candlelit chapel or the dusty center of a village was to witness terror incarnate. The afflicted seemed to vanish and return in seconds. Their voices changed, their expressions distorted, their movements uncontrollable, and in a time where the body was believed to reflect the soul, this rupture of control meant only one thing: something had entered, something dark. The afflicted were often not pitied. They were feared. They were taken not to beds, but to altars, tied in some cases with ropes or leather straps, their wrists bound to keep them from injuring others or themselves. Families prayed over them. Priests read from sacred texts, and the rituals began. Holy water, candles, chants, the invocation of saints. In some instances, relics were pressed to the skin, believed to burn out the invader. In others, the person was left in a church overnight, surrounded by crucifixes and symbols of divine power. Some were starved, their food restricted to pure substances in hopes of cleansing the spirit. Others were denied sleep, believed to be more vulnerable in dream. And sometimes the treatment was not symbolic at all. It was violent. Exorcisms in medieval Europe were rarely gentle affairs. Shouting, striking, even physical restraint were common. The seizure was not understood as suffering. It was seen as resistance. And so the one who trembled was treated as a battleground between the holy and the unholy, between the body and the foreign presence within. The person inside that body, the real person, was often forgotten. Children were especially vulnerable. A child who seized might be kept hidden from the community. Their presence could bring shame or suspicion upon the family. Parents struggled to reconcile love with fear. Teachers avoided them. Midwives marked them as different. And as they grew, if they survived, many found themselves isolated, not by choice, but by the mystery that clung to them. Women, too, were at particular risk. A young woman who fainted, convulsed, or behaved erratically was sometimes suspected not only of possession, but of witchcraft. Her symptoms became evidence. Her suffering became proof. And in the worst of cases, she became not a patient, but a prisoner. There are accounts of women shackled in churches, left for days in fasting and silence, awaiting divine intervention. Some died this way. Others emerged changed, not by healing, but by trauma. The line between ritual and torture blurred until it vanished. Not all who experienced seizures were mistreated. In some monastic settings, those afflicted were seen as chosen, witnesses to unseen realms. Their visions were recorded, their words transcribed, especially if they spoke of angels, demons, or saints. But even in reverence, there was a deep misunderstanding. Their value was often tied not to their well-being, but to the messages their seizures were believed to carry. And yet, across villages and cities, there remained those who tried, quietly, without doctrine, to offer care. Mothers who wrapped their children in wool and sang to them after the fits passed. Neighbors who stood watch at night, not out of fear, but out of duty. A monk who, despite all teachings, saw not a demon, but a frightened soul. These small acts rarely made it into the records, but they existed. Beneath the surface of punishment and fear, threads of compassion endured. To live with epilepsy in the medieval world was to live under constant scrutiny. Every twitch, every feint, every unexplained silence could be misread. The body was not allowed to be irregular. To be different was to be suspect, and in that suspicion, many were lost, misunderstood, punished, forgotten. The seizures came without warning. The judgment followed swiftly. And in the absence of understanding, fear filled the space where care might have been. But inside those trembling bodies were minds that remembered, that hoped, that feared not only the illness, but the hands that gripped too tightly, the voices that shouted too loudly, the eyes that looked not with pity but with condemnation. And long after the fit passed, long after the ropes were untied and the prayers had ended, the silence that followed was not peace. It was exile. A quiet reminder that in that world the body was not only a vessel of pain, it was a question. One that too few dared to answer with gentleness. A spoon pauses in midair. A cough stifled behind a sleeve, quickly swallowed with a sip of cold ale. A glance cast sideways when someone rubs their chest, just once, a little too long, silence. These were the signs, the quiet, the nearly invisible, the weightless gestures that carried a world of fear. In the Middle Ages, to be sick was not always a declaration. More often, it was a secret. Illness did not arrive with trumpets, nor did it always announce itself with obvious fever or injury. It crept in like a shadow at dusk, slowly, relentlessly. And for those who felt the first touch of it, the reaction was not always to seek help. It was to hide. Because help could mean exposure. Exposure could mean exile. So the sick learned to silence their symptoms. A cough became a whisper. A limp was masked as stiffness from labor. Pale skin was hidden beneath shawls. Eyes that burned from fever were averted, and pain, the constant companion, was pressed down into the stomach, the chest, the back of the throat, anywhere but the voice. To admit illness was to risk more than scorn. It was to risk removal from one's home, from one's family. It meant being avoided, suspected, blamed. So people lived with the pain, and in doing so, they became artists of concealment. A merchant might lean against a table longer than usual, pretending to inspect his wares when really catching his breath. A mother might work twice as hard, masking her fatigue and movement, so no one would question why she had stopped singing. A monk might kneel longer in prayer, not out of piety, but because standing was too much, and no one asked, not because they didn't see, but because they didn't want to know. In a world where the body and soul were believed to be so intertwined, sickness was not just a condition, it was a judgment. It meant something, a punishment, a warning, a sign of sin, and so even the suggestion of it could provoke shame. At night, in cramped homes, someone might cry softly beneath their breath, muffled by straw pillows. In shared rooms, a sleeper might turn away from their own coughing parent, too afraid to be close. Some walked farther from the village when they felt the fever rising, choosing the cold of isolation over the horror of being named ill. It wasn't just the sick who changed their behavior, the healthy did too. They stopped asking questions. They stopped lingering at doorsteps. They chose different benches in the church, sat on opposite ends of the table. They invented errands to avoid visiting certain homes. And always, they watched, discreetly. The slight wince, the missed step, the dampness at someone's collar. The air was thick with unspoken knowing. There are stories, fragmented, passed through generations, of neighbors ignoring the cries that echoed at night, of entire communities that pretended not to hear, not because they were cruel, but because they were afraid. And silence was a form of protection. Yet within this web of fear there were glimmers of compassion. A loaf left at a doorstep, no knock given. A child delivering herbs with instructions to say nothing. A priest praying from a distance, too scared to enter but unable to stay away. These acts were small, almost invisible, but they mattered. They acknowledged the person behind the symptom, the soul behind the shadow. Sometimes the sick pretended to recover. For days, weeks, even as their strength failed, they kept up the appearance of health until they couldn't. And when the body finally gave out, collapsed in the field, or grew too weak to rise, only then was the truth undeniable. And by then, it was often too late. There were no diagnoses, no certainty, just the slow unraveling of a person who once laughed, who once danced, who once worked beside you, now fading. And it was all the more tragic for how long they had tried to hide it. This quiet kind of suffering, the daily, hidden kind, is perhaps the most human. It reveals how much people will do to be part of the world, how far they'll go to avoid being cast out, and how deeply they need not only to survive, but to belong. Even now, centuries later, we know that kind of silence, that effort to look well, to sound strong, to not worry those around us, to press through pain and pretend. And so when we think of the Middle Ages, we must also think of the people who lived in quiet fear, who covered their mouths when they coughed, who smiled while their bones ached, who suffered not with spectacle, but with grace. Each movement, each glance, each pause, they were all part of a silent language, a language of hidden pain, a language of survival. There is a hush in the village square, broken only by the soft shuffle of feet and the occasional murmur. A priest adjusts his robes beneath the stone canopy of the church steps. The crowd waits, not for a sermon, but for a proclamation. A name has been spoken, a body has been judged, but not by physicians, nor by any divine voice. The judgment comes from men, from those who hold power. And the punishment, though cloaked in ritual and scripture, reveals much more than just a concern for the soul. It reveals the machinery of control. In the medieval world, to fall ill was not only to contend with the raw fragility of the human body, it was to enter a web of power, visible and invisible, where illness became a narrative, and that narrative served someone. Disease, especially when it was misunderstood or feared, did not spread equally. Nor did responses to it emerge from pure intentions. Every rule, every isolation, every public shunning was, in one way or another, shaped by who was in charge and who they believed deserved protection, care, or condemnation. Those who ruled locally, be they feudal lords, abbots, bishops, or the wealthy members of a city council, interpreted illness through the lens of order. Their responsibility was not healing, it was maintenance of hierarchy, of discipline, of perceived moral cleanliness. And in this task, sickness became an opportunity. When a person was declared unclean, contagious, or spiritually afflicted, it created space, not just physical space, but moral distance. The sick person, now a danger, could be moved out of homes, off the streets, beyond the walls. This removal often had little to do with recovery. In most cases, it was not about curing, it was about clearing. Many who were exiled to the edges of towns, to forests or empty barns, were not chosen because of the severity of their symptoms, but because of who they were: the poor, the outcast, the widow without a dowry, the stranger. These figures, already on the margins, became convenient containers for communal anxiety, and those with the authority to declare someone unclean were the same ones who benefited from their silence. Consider the priests who proclaimed that sickness was a sign of God's wrath, who decided which sins were responsible, who controlled the path to absolution. Those same priests offered paid indulgences, blessed water, access to relics, all for a fee. For those who could afford the right prayers and donations, healing was positioned as possible. For those who could not, sickness remained a test or a punishment. Or think of the village lord who, upon hearing that one of his tenants was ill, declared the entire household quarantined. Food ceased. Rent continued. No compensation was offered. The tenant's field went untended. And when the family was finally evicted for failing their duties, the land returned to the Lord's control. All under the guise of health and safety. Power preserved under the banner of protection. Hospitals themselves, such as they were, reflected these same hierarchies. Often attached to religious institutions, they were places of spiritual care, not medical healing. Entrance might be granted not to the most ill, but to those with connections, to the pious, to those whose suffering could be molded into a narrative of redemption. Others waited outside the gates, dying not from disease alone, but from being deemed unworthy of entry. When plague came, when fevers ran high and death knocked indiscriminately, fear allowed these hierarchies to harden further. Entire neighborhoods, typically the poorest, were closed off, patrolled, starved. City leaders fled to the countryside. Letters between nobility discuss methods for keeping servants in line, not for aiding the sick. The disease became a justification for old prejudices and a mechanism for reinforcing them. And yet, within these cold systems, the human cost bled through. A mother unable to see her child. A laborer barred from work after a single cough. A young woman left behind not because she was most ill, but because no one saw value in bringing her with them. The punishment of the sick was not merely an accident of ignorance, it was a reflection of power, of how societies measure worth, of how those at the top protect themselves, not with walls alone, but with narratives that turn pain into suspicion and sickness into shame. It's easy, perhaps, to imagine that these systems were distant, products of a crueler, simpler time. But the structure, the use of illness as judgment, the alignment of healing with wealth, the quiet abandonment of the most vulnerable, these echoes remain. They speak from the margins of medieval texts, from the forgotten graves at the edge of villages, from the records of bodies buried without names. To be sick in the Middle Ages was to be seen through the eyes of power, and more often than not, those eyes were cold. What we learn from these punishments, these exclusions, is not only how people feared disease, it is how they organized themselves in response to fear, who they protected, who they blamed, and most tellingly, who they allowed to disappear. And those disappearances, as quiet as they were never accidental. They were the inevitable result of systems designed not to heal, but to decide who was worth the trouble. His name was never written in stone. No chapel bore his initials, no family tree carried his memory. But for a brief moment in the mid-14th century, in a small hamlet pressed between fields and forest, his body stood at the center of fear. He was a simple man, a tenant farmer, calloused hands, bent back, the scent of soil embedded in every fold of his tunic. He had no riches, no title. Only a patch of land and the loyalty of a dog that followed him to the edge of every row he plowed. When he began to cough, it was spring. A dry cough at first, blamed on dust and cold air from the thaw. He ignored it. He had fields to till, tools to mend, and no time for weakness. But as days passed, the cough deepened. He grew pale. The neighbors noticed how he no longer joined the communal bread oven, how his voice, once gruff and steady, now sounded like wind through dry reeds. It was a child who saw the first spots on his neck, dark, swollen, unnatural. The child's mother pulled her back in silence. From that moment, the whispers began. At first it was concern, then fear, and then something colder. One evening, a villager placed a bundle of herbs outside his door, rosemary, thyme, and wormwood, wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar. No words were exchanged. The message was clear. He was not to leave. He was not to speak. He was not to be touched. There was no priest who came to visit, no doctor from the monastery. Only the sound of footsteps retreating and the occasional thud of bread or grain left on a doorstep. He did not ask for more. He knew what they believed. Some said he had sinned in secret, that his illness was not natural, but punishment. Others believed he had been cursed by a passing stranger, or worse, had brought it upon himself through unknown rituals. No one asked him. They only looked at him differently through the slats of their windows, as if watching a storm they dared not stop. The fever rose, his body weakened, his beard grew wild, untamed. At night he cried out, not from the illness alone, but from the echoing silence that surrounded him. His name, once called across the fields, was no longer spoken, not even in prayer. The village elders met in private and made a decision. His house would not be approached again. If he died, he would be buried by moonlight, by the youngest of the gravediggers, those without families of their own. There would be no procession, no candle, no hymn. In his final days, the man sat by the small window of his home, watching the sky change. The dog lay at his feet, refusing to eat. His hands, once strong enough to break earth, trembled with each breath. And still he waited, for sound, for forgiveness, for someone. But no one came. When he died, the bell did not toll. The door remained closed for 2 more days. Then, under cover of night, 2 figures approached, faces covered, hands gloved. They carried his body, already stiff, to a shallow grave beyond the edge of consecrated land. The dog followed, then lay atop the mound, and would not move again. The village returned to its rhythm. The crops were planted, the bread was baked. Children laughed again in the fields, but his name, once carved into the rhythm of that life, vanished. Not by accident, by intent. He had been diagnosed not through signs or science, but through fear, labeled not ill, but accursed. He bore not just a sickness of the flesh, but the weight of collective dread. And in the end, the greatest pain was not the fever, nor the solitude. It was the erasure. Years later, a new tenant would take his land. His house would collapse and be rebuilt. His grave, never marked, would grow wild with weeds. The dog's bones would bleach under the sun, and no one would speak of the man who coughed in spring and disappeared by summer. Yet he existed. Not as a caution, not as a symbol, but as a life, brief, human, and silenced. In him, we see the full cruelty of ignorance and the quiet violence of collective abandonment. And in remembering his shadow, we remember all the others, those who fell ill before medicine, before mercy, before anyone dared to say their names without fear. In a stone chamber lit by the flicker of candlelight, a monk leans over a parchment. His quill scratches the surface with quiet reverence, copying a prayer or perhaps transcribing a passage from Augustine. Around him, silence reigns. The walls are thick, the air cool, and the scent of wax, damp stone, and old vellum fills the space. Here, in the stillness of the medieval scriptorium, the body is not the object of study. The soul is. To understand why illness was so often spiritualized in the Middle Ages, one must begin in these monasteries. These were not hospitals in any modern sense. They were sanctuaries of contemplation, centers of religious scholarship, and guardians of theological truth. And above all, they were places where the mystery of human suffering was interpreted not through science, but through Scripture. Monks believed the body to be a vessel, temporary, fallible, prone to sin and decay. The soul, however, was eternal. It was the soul that mattered, the soul that needed cleansing, guidance, discipline. When a person fell ill, the question asked was not, "What is wrong with the body?" but "What has disturbed the soul?" This belief ran deep. Illness was seen as both a trial and a message. A fever could be a test of faith. A seizure might be divine punishment. A wasting disease, a call to repentance. These were not metaphors, they were lived realities. And so, care for the sick became care for the spirit. Prayers were recited, confessions were encouraged, and suffering was framed as participation in the Passion of Christ. The act of tending to the sick was, for many monks, a spiritual obligation, but not always a medical one. They would sit beside the afflicted, read psalms, anoint foreheads with sacred oil. Their role was to ease the path toward death, not to interfere with its timing, to prepare the soul for departure, rather than struggle to keep the body tethered to the earth. Autopsies were largely forbidden. To cut into a body was to desecrate what God had made. The internal workings of flesh were not mysteries to be solved. They were sacred territories, not meant for human exploration. What could be known should be known through divine revelation, not through dissection. The libraries of these monasteries were filled with texts, but not with medical treatises grounded in empirical study. Instead, one would find commentaries on the book of Job, instructions for penance, visions of saints, and tales of martyrdom. When disease was mentioned, it was often alongside demons, temptations, or divine wrath. Remedies, if offered, were as likely to involve relics or prayers as they were herbs. There were exceptions. Some monasteries maintained small herb gardens, and certain monks, especially in the Benedictine tradition, recorded observations about plants and their effects. But even then, the guiding principle was the alignment of natural order with divine will. Healing occurred when body, soul, and cosmos were harmonized through piety. This worldview shaped more than monastic life. It influenced the entire medieval approach to illness. Physicians deferred to theologians. Diagnoses were shaped by spiritual interpretation. A patient might be prescribed confession rather than a cure. And often, the success of any treatment was judged not by survival, but by whether the patient died in a state of grace. Those who questioned this system faced resistance. To suggest that disease might have a biological cause, that the body might operate under laws separate from the divine, was to challenge the authority of the Church. Such ideas, when they did arise, were suppressed or dismissed, labeled heretical, dangerous, or simply misguided. And so the study of the soul flourished while the study of the body languished. The implications of this were profound. Diseases that might have been understood, treated, even prevented, were instead endured in silence. People suffered with faith but without knowledge. They died surrounded by Scripture but far from the possibility of recovery. The walls of the monastery kept out the noise of the world, but they also kept out the possibility of progress. And yet, within this austere spiritual framework, there was a kind of beauty. The sick were not abandoned. They were held, not as patients, but as souls in need of comfort. Their pain was witnessed, their fears soothed, their deaths marked with dignity. To be cradled in prayer, to be sung to in one's final hours, to be mourned with a chants that rose like incense, this, too, was a form of care. In a world where medicine had not yet separated itself from belief, this was the best that many could offer. The monks did not study the body because they believed deeply that it was not their place, that their charge was higher, that in lifting the soul, they were lifting the whole person, and perhaps in their quiet candlelit rooms, surrounded by silence and psalms, they touched a kind of truth, one not made of cures or answers, but of presence, of being there when no one else would. The cities of medieval Europe did not grow randomly. Their streets did not wind aimlessly, nor did their walls merely follow the contours of geography. Beneath every cobblestone, behind every high archway and hidden alley, there was a silent architect far more powerful than any builder or planner. That architect was fear, specifically the fear of disease. This fear etched itself into the very bones of urban design. While modern cities often celebrate openness, movement, and contact, medieval towns were built to contain, to divide, to protect the healthy from the suspected, and to conceal the sick from the eyes of the living. In many walled cities, entire quarters were designated, though rarely openly, for those believed to be impure. These were not official districts named on any map, but those who lived there knew. The air was thicker, the water less clean, the walls closer. These neighborhoods became places of quiet exile within the heart of the city. Architecture responded. Narrow passageways, just wide enough for one person to pass, prevented gatherings. Small windows discouraged prying eyes. Many homes had separate rear doors, used not for convenience but for discretion, to remove a corpse, to carry out the waste of the sick, to allow entry to those who came not to visit, but to cleanse. Even sacred spaces adapted. Some churches installed leper windows, small shuttered openings at the side of the building through which those deemed unclean could watch Mass from the outside without entering. These windows were often so low that the sick would have to kneel in mud or snow just to catch a glimpse of salvation. And the hospitals, those early bleak sanctuaries, were intentionally placed at the city's edge or beyond its gates. They were not places one went to recover, but places to wait for death. Their isolation was by design, and the roads that led to them were straight and sunken, easy to watch, easy to seal. This obsession with containment extended even to the dead. Cemeteries were sometimes expanded rapidly in response to plague, pushing against city walls and into uninhabited spaces. Mass graves were dug in secret places, away from homes, from markets, from memory. Over time, entire areas of the city became unspoken zones of death, walked around, never through. Walls were not just for keeping enemies out, they were for keeping infection in. During outbreaks, city gates could be locked entirely. Watchmen were posted not to defend from armies, but to observe the signs of illness, a limp, a covered mouth, a pale complexion. Suspicion became part of the city's rhythm, and with it, the very definition of what a safe space meant changed. The movement of goods and people adapted accordingly. Vendors in certain areas were forbidden to sell wares. Water carriers were directed to avoid specific wells. Carts were routed through side streets to bypass infected houses. These shifts were not temporary. Over decades, they shaped the very layout of marketplaces, the distribution of wells, the placement of taverns and inns. Architecture did not only respond to fear, it preserved it. Some of these designs lasted long after the memory of the diseases that inspired them had faded. A crooked lane, a narrow courtyard, a row of houses built without doors facing the main road, each bore silent witness to past attempts at protection. Even sound was shaped by fear. Bells were used to signal the approach of the infected, to warn others of funerals in progress, or to mark houses where the sick lay inside. Some cities mandated special garb, hats, bells, or patches to identify those recovering from certain illnesses. These individuals moved through space like walking warnings, and their routes became ghost paths no one else dared follow. But perhaps the most haunting expression of this architecture of fear lies in what was hidden, not built. Underground tunnels and side entrances were constructed not for escape, but for movement without notice. Secret paths through gardens, hidden alcoves behind churches, routes used to carry out the dying, or to bring priests to those who were not allowed inside. In some towns, these paths were later sealed, their entrances bricked over. But the air remembers. What this all reveals is a truth not always spoken, that cities, though made of stone and timber, are also made of emotion. And in the medieval world, fear of illness was more than personal, it was civic. It became a force more enduring than war or famine. It shaped the places where people lived, worked, and died. Today, we walk through those same cities. We marvel at the curves of alleyways, the uneven steps, the sudden narrowing of a street. And we do not always see the hands of fear that carved them, but they are there. And in remembering them, we remember that disease has always done more than sicken the body. It has shaped the world around it, silently, permanently, stone by stone. The past is never entirely past. Sometimes it lingers not in books or ruins, but in gestures, in the way someone recoils when another coughs, in the silent judgment cast upon a face flushed with fever, in the hesitations, the refusals, the quiet distances people place between themselves and those deemed risky. These echoes, carried across centuries, whisper a hard truth. The way medieval societies responded to disease, to suffering, to the strange and the unwell, those responses are not buried in time. They are reborn in us. In the modern world, we pride ourselves on progress. We speak of vaccines, of healthcare systems, of data and science. Yet when fear arrives, sudden, shapeless, and contagious, it does not ask for rationality, it asks for instinct. And so we find ourselves returning to patterns we believed long forgotten. During recent pandemics, the language shifted. People were no longer simply sick, they were dangerous. Contagion became not only a biological threat, but a moral one. Who had followed the rules? Who had been reckless? And who, in their suffering, might bring harm to others? Much like in the Middle Ages, illness became a symbol. The person coughing in a store became a subject of silent condemnation. The family under quarantine received glances that bordered on fear. Delivery drivers left packages at thresholds like medieval villagers leaving food outside the door of a condemned soul, contactless, wordless, and cold. Entire neighborhoods were labeled as hot zones, echoing the quarantine districts of old. The wealthy found ways to isolate with comfort. The poor, as always, bore the brunt of exposure. Essential workers, many with no choice but to keep moving through danger, were both praised and quietly avoided. Even the way we grieved bore marks of medieval sorrow, funerals without touch, goodbyes spoken through screens, mourning in solitude. The rituals, stripped of closeness, recalled the unceremonious burials of plague victims hurried through with more fear than reverence, and the search for culprits returned too. In medieval times, foreigners, women, and the poor were often blamed for outbreaks, whispers of witchcraft, of divine punishment, of curses hidden in strange words. Today we point to travelers, to the careless, to those who choose differently from ourselves. The targets change, but the instinct remains. We speak of science, but beneath the data, our behaviors are still shaped by something older, a need to define boundaries, a desire to feel safe through separation, a fear that, in trying to protect others, we may become the ones left behind. Some masked not just for health, but to shield themselves from the gaze of judgment. Others avoided hospitals not for lack of trust, but for fear of being seen as weak, as vulnerable, as suspect. The very act of coughing in public became a performance, an apology, a plea, a risk. Just as in the medieval village, silence became a strategy. People hid their symptoms, downplayed their pain, avoided disclosure out of fear of being isolated, not because they wished to harm others, but because they had seen how quickly compassion could turn to avoidance, how quickly empathy could dissolve into suspicion. And yet, in both eras, there was also resistance. Not grand, loud defiance, but the quiet rebellion of care. Neighbors delivering food without fanfare, strangers sewing masks by hand, nurses who risked their own health to sit beside those who would otherwise die alone. These were not acts of heroism in the loud sense. They were acts of humanity, fragments of light in a pattern shaped by fear. We carry the same bodies as those who lived centuries ago, bodies that ache, that heal, that tremble at the unknown. And we carry the same needs, to be seen, to be comforted, to be held. When we look at medieval responses to disease with a mixture of horror and pity, we must also look inward. What in us still clings to the instinct to exclude, to judge, to step back instead of reaching out? And perhaps in seeing these reflections we can begin, not to erase the patterns, but to soften them. To remember that in both past and present, it is not always the sickness that wounds most deeply. It is the silence. The abandonment, the cold gaze that sees the ill not as human, but as risk. That gaze can be turned away, that pattern can, slowly, be redrawn. In the dim corridors of medieval thought, there was a silence more dangerous than any plague. It was not the silence of illness or solitude, but the silence of unasked questions, the stillness of a world where those who suffered had no words for their pain, and those who held power had no desire to seek new answers. This was not accidental. It was institutional. Ignorance in the Middle Ages was not simply a lack of knowledge. It was curated, maintained, cultivated by those for whom certainty meant stability and mystery meant control. And it was this carefully preserved ignorance that shaped the way societies responded to illness, with fear, with ritual, with exile. The Church, as the dominant authority on both moral and practical life, held a near monopoly on interpretation. It was the priests who spoke for God, the monks who copied the texts, the theologians who debated not how the body worked, but what the soul's suffering meant. To question these frameworks was to question divine will itself. Scientific inquiry, what little existed, was tethered to theological doctrine. Illness could be described in terms of humors or stars, but always through the lens of moral meaning. The black bile that caused melancholy, the air that brought fever, these were not studied to be corrected, but to be accepted. To heal was not to cure, but to endure with grace. Autopsies were rare and often forbidden. Anatomy was not seen as a frontier of understanding, but as a terrain too sacred or too profane to explore. Human dissection was, in many places, a sin. Thus, the body remained a mystery, cloaked in reverence and taboo. The consequence of this was staggering. Generations of healers guessing blindly, passing down error as inheritance. This institutionalized ignorance did not only affect the learned. It bled into every corner of daily life. Midwives, herbalists, and local healers, those who possessed knowledge rooted in observation and practice, were often dismissed or persecuted. Their understanding of symptoms, their careful blending of plants and poultices, was deemed inferior to the recitations of prayers and the swinging of censers. When these women and men dared to succeed where sanctioned methods failed, they risked being labeled heretics or witches. Knowledge itself became suspect if it did not follow the prescribed path. Books that deviated from dogma were burned. Scholars who dared to propose alternative explanations were silenced or exiled. The rare few who experimented in secret had to cloak their discoveries in religious language, lest they be accused of pride or blasphemy, and the cost of this was not only intellectual, it was human. Patients were bled dry by doctrine. Children were left untreated because their symptoms could not be spiritually interpreted. Epidemics spread because no one dared to ask whether illness might come from filth, from fleas, from the unseen workings of a contaminated world. The answers were hidden in plain sight, but the will to see was absent. Why? Because knowledge redistributes power. To admit that disease might have a natural cause was to admit that the church might not hold all truth. To acknowledge that a peasant midwife could heal more effectively than a cathedral physician was to challenge the social order. And so ignorance was defended not with silence alone, but with ceremony, with judgment, with force. But ignorance, once institutionalized, has inertia. Even when confronted with evidence, institutions slow to change. Generations raised in reverence for sacred interpretations hesitate to question them. And those in power, consciously or not, come to rely on that slowness, on the comfort of old explanations, on the fear of what lies beyond. In this way, the medieval world taught not only how to believe, but how not to know. It taught communities to interpret pain through Scripture, to see suffering as deserved, and to trust only those who echoed the same ancient truths. It taught people to be wary of questions, to prefer ritual over reason, to watch others suffer without asking if it could be different. And though centuries have passed, this pattern, too, lingers. In moments of crisis, many still turn first to tradition, to certainty, to the familiar voices, even when they are wrong. The fear of change, of complexity, of admitting we don't know, echoes through time. It is not born from cruelty, but from a system built to preserve itself. The Middle Ages remind us that ignorance is not merely the absence of knowledge. It is a structure, a habit, a shield. And sometimes that shield is held not against the darkness of the world, but against the light that dares to illuminate it. There is a kind of silence that doesn't soothe, but unravels. It begins softly, like the hush of snowfall, or the muffled weight of thick stone walls. But over time, that silence begins to press in. It fills the space between breaths, stretches the hours into something unmeasurable. In medieval Europe, for those who were cast out, locked in, or hidden away under the label of contagion, this was the silence they endured, not as a choice, but as a sentence. Isolation in the Middle Ages was not simply a precaution. It was a method of control, a mark of judgment, and often a death sentence disguised as protection. Those who exhibited symptoms, whether of fever, rash, or breathlessness, were separated not just from their communities, but from the sounds of human life itself. No voices, no footsteps, no laughter, only the ticking of their own decline. In the absence of touch, of voice, of eye contact, the mind begins to distort. Some records speak of people who screamed for days without response, who pounded on doors not for freedom, but simply to be heard, to be known as still alive, to be reminded that they existed. But the doors remained shut. The village had moved on. The world outside, driven by fear, often chose to forget them before their final breath had even come. This sensory deprivation imposed by superstition and fear had consequences beyond the physical. The mind, deprived of connection, began to invent. Shadows on the wall became voices. The flicker of a candle turned into a whisper. The creak of a timber became a footstep, someone coming, or perhaps someone already there. Delirium did not always come from fever. It came from solitude. There are accounts, quiet ones, scribbled in margins of letters or preserved in monastic chronicles, of isolated patients who began to confess to crimes they had never committed, who claimed to see angels or devils, who tore at their own skin not because of disease, but because it was the only sensation left. Some sang to themselves, others recited prayers until their tongues bled. The body denied the world, turned on itself. And what was most tragic, no one came to witness it. Their suffering unfolded in private, their descent unmarked by family, clergy, or friend, a life unacknowledged, a mind that faded into dust with no voice to say, "This person was here." But the isolation was not always physical. Even within homes, some were exiled by silence. A mother sleeping in the barn so as not to breathe near her children, a husband forbidden to share a bed, meals left at the edge of a room, eye contact avoided. Every cough met with stillness, and the fear that surrounded the sick became internalized. Many began to believe they were truly cursed, that their thoughts were dangerous, that their breath carried not just illness, but sin. The mind, fragile and seeking reason, made sense of the abandonment by turning guilt inward. This is happening to me, they thought, because I deserve it. This kind of isolation did more than break spirits. It reshaped them. Some recovered, but never fully returned. They emerged thinner, not just in body, but in soul, their eyes searching, unsure how to be seen again, unsure if they were still part of the world that had once so easily removed them. Others never made it back. And in the towns that locked them away, life continued. Children grew, bread rose in ovens, the bells tolled for births and marriages. The silent rooms of the isolated were rarely mentioned again. Their absence became a habit, their names faded, their stories unfinished. In modern times, we understand the cost of isolation more clearly. We speak of its toll on the nervous system, on mental health, on memory, and cognition. But in the Middle Ages, there were no such terms. There was only silence, and those left alone to unravel inside it. When we think of medieval illness, we imagine sores and coughs and fever. But the truest suffering for many was this: to be untouched, unseen, unheard, to die not from disease, but from absence, the absence of care, the absence of witness, the absence of a single voice to say, "You are still here, you matter still." This was the wound no herb could heal, the fever no prayer could break. And in remembering it now, perhaps we reclaim what they were denied, the simple dignity of being seen, even in silence, even in suffering. In the stillness of the modern night, a hush descends on hospital corridors, much like it once did in medieval sick rooms. The machines may hum now, the lighting may be artificial, but the essence, the fear, the solitude, the suspended breath remains hauntingly familiar. It is in these spaces, both past and present, that the same quiet ritual continues. A ritual not born of religion or culture alone, but of necessity, of grief, of the human need to make sense of the fading presence of another. In the Middle Ages, death often came without ceremony. Especially in times of plague or war, the dead were removed without touch, without kin, without a name. Some were carried away before breath had fully left their bodies, mistaken for corpses in the panic to contain disease. Others were buried at night, away from the eyes of the village, in mass graves without markers. But even so, small rituals emerged, a cross made in the dirt, a prayer murmured under the breath, a candle left flickering long after hope had gone. Today these gestures still exist, not always recognized, not always named, but deeply felt. A nurse covering a patient's face with gentle hands, a family member whispering a final goodbye through glass. The deliberate folding of a blanket after a body is wheeled away. These acts, quiet, often unseen, are not procedural, they are echoes. Even now, in times of global contagion, the customs shift, but the instincts remain. We keep our distance, we wash obsessively, we whisper warnings to our children not to touch, not to go near. And when death comes, we grieve in isolation. Funerals streamed through screens, burials limited to numbers, to time, to logistics. The human desire to gather, to embrace, to speak a name aloud, interrupted by the same fear that once shaped medieval silence. And still, we invent new rituals. Stones left on doorsteps, photographs placed on empty chairs, a name written in chalk on a wall, then washed away by rain. These are the descendants of medieval mourning, shaped not by religion, but by the stubborn ache of needing to remember. In those earlier centuries, mourning was often preemptive. Parents did not name their children until weeks had passed. Wives did not speak of pregnancy aloud. People loved cautiously, because the risk of loss was constant, and so silence became its own language. Eyes meeting across a room, a hand placed briefly on a shoulder, a moment of shared breath, nothing said, everything understood. We believe we are far from that world, that with medicine and data and control, we are beyond the grip of such rituals, but grief is not so easily managed. It returns in cycles, in movements, in the way we speak to the dying, or the way we refuse to speak at all. There is a moment that repeats even now, the stillness after the final breath. The question that lingers in the room, what do we do now? And in that space we find ourselves reaching not for explanation, but for meaning, for a gesture, a rhythm, a ritual. It is the act of lighting a candle in a window or of setting a place at the table for someone who is no longer there. It is the pause before erasing a voicemail, the hesitation before washing a pillowcase. It is, in essence, the continuation of that ancient need to honor what has gone without words. And perhaps this is what most binds us to those who came before, not our methods of treatment, not our understanding of illness, but our mourning, our rituals of absence. We still fear the touch, we still fear the silence, and we still try, in the smallest ways, to break it, to leave a light burning, to fold a blanket just so, to say a name aloud, even if no one is there to hear it. These are the rituals that carry us, that connect the cold stone floors of a medieval hospice to the clean tiles of a modern ward, the humanity that flickers between the two. And as long as we remember to perform them, even when no one is watching, we remain tethered to something enduring, not knowledge, but care, not progress, but memory. There is a sorrow in history that resists numbers, that refuses to be tallied, listed, archived. It is the sorrow of those who died unseen, unremembered, unnamed, the ones whose suffering left no record, no monument, no gravestone, no prayer, only absence, only a void. In medieval times, this absence was common. It wasn't reserved for the rebellious or the criminal. It fell upon the sick, those whose bodies failed them and whose communities failed them in return, whose slow decay was hidden behind closed shutters, whose moans were muffled by wooden doors, who in the end passed from life not with dignity, but with the silence of abandonment. And yet their silence speaks. What we learn from them, those who apodrisceram in silencio, is not just a medical history of errors and ignorance. It is a mirror, a long, dark mirror held up to the structure of how we choose to care, and how we choose not to. We learn that disease, when stripped of its physical symptoms, reveals the scaffolding of society. Who is protected, who is left behind, who is touched, and who is avoided. In the medieval world, illness was a test not just of faith, but of social worth. The rich died cleaner, the poor died sooner, women died quieter, children died without names. And behind each of these deaths was a choice made by a village, a priest, a neighbor, not to see, not to speak, not to stay. These choices echo still. Even in our time of machines and medicine, people continue to die in rooms where no one enters. They die with diagnoses but without visitors. They pass surrounded by beeping monitors and fluorescent light, not by voices they love. And sometimes they die still uncertain of what exactly is taking them. The invisible has simply changed its shape. It is no longer a miasma or a divine punishment. It may be a late-stage diagnosis, a misunderstood mental illness, a crisis unspoken for too long. But the feeling of being erased while still alive remains. To reflect on those medieval bodies that decayed behind monastery walls, in plague pits, in the corners of unwashed huts, is to ask, how do we honor them now? Not with pity, not with horror, but with attention, with the willingness to admit that pain without witness is not less painful, that death without ritual is not less sacred, that every body, no matter how diseased, no matter how feared, held a person who once whispered, wept, hoped. We do not remember their names because history did not record them, but we can remember what they teach us. That care is not a science, it is a choice. That the truest cruelty is not infection, but neglect. And that healing, even now, begins not in medicine, but in the decision to remain, to hold a hand, to listen, to see. The final lesson they offer is not a historical one, it is a human one, that no one, no matter how poor, how strange, how feared, should die alone. That no suffering should be too small to matter, that behind every closed door there is a story, and if we pause, truly pause, to imagine them, we might hear them still, in the hush between breaths, in the cold quiet of an empty room, in the ache that comes not from illness, but from absence. May we carry their silence not as a weight, but as a reminder that the past is never truly gone. It waits always to be remembered, to be seen, to be held. Have a peaceful night. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, I'd be grateful if you gave a quiet click on the like button and subscribed for more winding journeys through the captivating and complicated annals of history. Until next time, sweet dreams.